Two moons hung over the field like two murky eyes. Ethan Pack lay face down in the wet grass and tasted earth on his lips. He couldn't remember how he'd ended up here. The last thing he remembered was the back seat of a taxi and the lights of Ulsan outside the window. Now there was nothing around him. No roads, no buildings, no sounds of the city, only the wind and the scent of wild grass. Ethan got down on his knees and ran his hand over his face. A beard, thick and coarse. He'd shaved every morning for the past 10 years and knew for sure that his chin had been smooth just yesterday. Now he had a beard like he hadn't shaved in a week. A translucent panel flashed before his eyes. Letters glowed with a soft blue light right in the air. Welcome, Lord. Your settlement? Garen Wastelands. Rank F-. Your workers? 1 out of 10. Ethan blinked. The panel didn't disappear. He reached out and his fingers passed right through the letters as if through smoke. He stood up and looked around. A crooked wooden palisade stretched out around him within a radius of several hundred meters. The logs stood askew. Some had already rotted at the base. Inside the fence, there was nothing but an earthen pit with a canopy of branches. This was apparently supposed to be the town hall. No well, no garden beds, not even a fire pit. Ethan slowly turned his head to the left. A man was standing by the gate. A skinny guy in his 20s, bald, barefoot. His clothes hung on him like they were on a hanger. His eyes were open, but empty, like those of a mannequin in a store window. A small sign hung above his head. Peasant, level 1, health 8 out of 10, name missing. Ethan looked at the sign, then at the young man, then back at the sign. 1 worker out of 10. He remembered how, 3 years ago, he'd been transferred to the factory in Ulsan and put in charge of assembly line number 7. The worst line in the entire factory. Old equipment, tired workers, 8% below target every month. His boss had said just one thing to him back then. Figure it out. And Ethan did. Within 6 months, Line 7 had become the best on the floor. Not because he replaced the machines, because every morning he stood by the conveyor belt and watched the people. Who was tired? Who was angry? Who wasn't working in their right place? He rearranged people like pieces on a board, and the line began to breathe. Now he had no line. No conveyor belt. There were no 20 workers. He had 1 man with empty eyes and a health rating of 8 out of 10. Ethan took a deep breath. Then he exhaled. Then he walked over to the guy and stood right in front of him. The worker didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there. Ethan looked him in the eyes and said 1 word. What's your name? Silence. The wind rustled the grass behind the stockade. The guy blinked. For the first time ever. Something changed in his face, barely noticeable, as if someone had lit a small candle inside an empty room. The sign above his head flickered. The letters rearranged themselves. Name. June. Ethan nodded. June. All right. Now there are 2 of us. He turned away and looked at the crooked stockade, at the pit with the canopy, at the empty field all around. The panel before his eyes showed that there were 29 days left until the first evaluation. He didn't know what an evaluation was, but the word was written in red, and that couldn't mean anything good. Ethan ran his finger across the panel and opened the rules section. The assessment takes place once a month. The bottom 5% of settlements, based on their combined rank, are destroyed. The Lord is eliminated. The workers are distributed among neighboring settlements. Ethan read it twice. Destroyed. Eliminated. He closed the panel and looked at June. The guy was standing in the same spot, staring at him. But now there was something in his eyes. Not emotion. More like anticipation. Like a new hire at a factory on his first day. Someone who doesn't know what to do yet, but is already ready to do whatever he's told. Ethan gestured toward the ground beneath their feet. We need a well. Have you ever dug one? June slowly shook his head. Ethan took off his jacket and tossed it onto the grass. He rolled up his shirt sleeves. Then I'll show you. They began digging with their bare hands. The soil in the Garen wastelands was dry and hard as rock. An hour later, Ethan's palms were raw and bleeding. 2 hours later, June found a sharp stone and began using it as a scraper. 4 hours later, they had dug half a meter deep. The panel reported that June had earned 2 experience points for manual labor. Ethan sat down on the edge of the pit and wiped his forehead. His hands were shaking. His back ached so much he couldn't straighten up. He looked at June. The boy was sitting next to him too, his hands just as scraped up, but he wasn't complaining. He didn't have the words to complain. Or maybe he just hadn't learned how to complain yet. Ethan pulled a crumpled energy bar out of his jacket pocket. the last one, from his past life. He broke it in half and held out a half to June. June took it. He looked at the bar, then at Ethan, and took a bite. The two of them sat on the edge of the pit that would one day be a well. 2 moons were rising above the horizon. Somewhere far beyond the stockade, a creature was howling. The panel flickered quietly in the darkness, counting down the days. 28 days until the assessment. 1 worker, 0 buildings, grade F-. Ethan finished his half of the bar and stood up. Tomorrow we'll start at dawn. We need water, then food, then walls. In that order. June nodded, and for the first time in this endless day, Ethan thought that maybe that nod was worth more than 10 obedient workers. Because June didn't nod out of obligation. He nodded because he'd heard him. 6 days passed like one long shift without a break. Ethan and June worked from dawn until dark. On the second day, they dug the hole down to water. It was murky and had an iron taste, but it was water. The panel classified the structure as a level 1 well and gave the settlement a +1 to its survival rank. On the third day, Ethan found a beginner's chest in the corner of the palisade. Inside were wheat and carrot seeds, an old axe with a cracked handle, a coil of rope, a long bow without a bowstring, and 10 arrows with blunt tips. Ethan took everything out and laid it out on the grass. The bow was useless without a bowstring. The axe would last for 3 days of chopping. The seeds had to be planted immediately. Ethan gave the axe to June and showed him how to chop down the thin trees behind the stockade. He himself began digging up the ground for the vegetable garden, with a rock, the very same one June had used to dig the well. By the evening of the third day, they had a 2-by-3-meter garden bed. The panel reported, Level 1 vegetable garden, harvest in 14 days. Ethan did the math in his head. 14 days until food. 26 days until the assessment. There were still 10 days' worth of system rations in the chest, 1 ration per day per worker. That would last 5 days for the two of them, if they split it. Ethan divided the rations, a little less for himself, a little more for June. June noticed this. He looked at Ethan, but he didn't say anything. On the 4th day, Ethan began to study the panel in earnest. He sat by the well and scrolled through the sections one by one. The worker system, the building system, the class system, the rating system. Each section revealed a new layer of rules. Workers were divided into ranks ranging from peasant to legendary class. To advance a peasant to hunter required 10 days of training and a certain amount of experience. From hunter to archer took another 20 days. From archer to bowman took another month. In total, it took at least 2 months to go from peasant to bowman. Ethan didn't have 2 months. He didn't even have 1. He flipped through the pages. Buildings required resources: wood, stone, and iron. A level 2 town hall required 200 units of wood and 50 units of stone. June chopped down 3 trees a day. Ethan chopped down 2. 5 trees a day. Each tree yielded 10 units, 50 a day. 4 days for 1 town hall. But without a level 2 town hall, he couldn't hire more than 3 workers. And rather workers, he couldn't build anything. A vicious cycle. Ethan sat and stared at the numbers. He'd seen cycles like this at the factory. No machine because there's no money. No money because there's no output. No output because there's no machine. At the factory, he'd solved it simply. He'd find 1 good person and put them in the right place. 1 person in the right place could break any vicious cycle. Ethan looked at June. The guy was chopping wood behind the stockade, methodically, without complaint. The axe rose and fell at a steady pace. But June was a level 3 peasant. His strength was 4 out of 10. His speed was 3 out of 10. Each swing of the axe chipped off a thin sliver. It took an hour to cut down 1 tree. Ethan closed the panel and walked over to June. He stopped him, took the axe, set it down on the ground. June sat down and looked up at him. Ethan crouched down across from him. He didn't know why, but he felt he had to try. He'd known June for 6 days. He knew that June woke up before dawn and sat by the well. He knew that June ate in silence and always left the last bite. He knew that June rubbed his left wrist when he got tired. He knew that June had once picked up a beetle that had flipped onto its back and set it back on its feet. 6 days. But Ethan knew more about him than he did about some of his colleagues after 3 years on the job. He placed his hand on June's shoulder and thought. Hunter. The panel flashed, brighter than usual. The letters scrolled quickly. A unique Lord's talent detected. Class S. Name. Mentor. Description. Change of profession without development chain restrictions. Class change activated. Peasant to hunter. Execution time, 30 seconds. Ethan held his breath. 30 seconds. He watched as the label above June's head flashed. The letters rearranged themselves. Peasant disappeared. Hunter appeared. Level 1. But his stats? Strength 6, Dexterity 7, Perception 8. June blinked. Then he looked at his hands, then at Ethan. There was something new in his eyes. He saw things differently. He heard differently. The panel continued to display text. Additional abilities of the mentor talent. Race change, cloning, experience redistribution, profession memory. Restriction, 1 activation per day. Only on workers whose names and identities are known to the Lord. Ethan read and felt his mouth go dry. It was impossible. All the other lords spent months raising a single worker by 2 classes. It took him 30 seconds. But the panel wasn't lying. June the Hunter stood before him, turning his head from side to side like someone putting on glasses for the first time. Ethan stood up. He picked up a bow from the newcomer's chest. The bow had no string, but June the Hunter looked at the coil of rope and, without a word, cut off a piece. He strung it on the bow. He checked the tension. His fingers moved with confidence, as if he'd done this 100 times. Ethan watched and thought. This was it. One person in the right place. The vicious cycle was broken. There were 23 days left until the evaluation. 1 worker. But now that worker could be anyone. Ethan opened the panel and began to count. If he could change June's class every day, then in 23 days, June would have held 23 different professions. A hunter to gather food, a carpenter for construction, a mason for walls, a farmer for the garden, a cook to prepare food. 1 person instead of 10. Not because he was stronger, but because he was more versatile. At the factory, Ethan called such people universal operators, those who could fill any position without compromising quality. June was a universal operator of a caliber that didn't exist. Ethan closed the panel and looked at June. The young man stood with a bow in his hands, waiting. Ethan gestured toward the forest beyond the stockade. We need food. Show us what the hunter can do. June nodded and walked out through the gate. 2 hours later, he returned with 3 rabbits and a pheasant. His eyes were shining, not with pride, but with surprise. He hadn't even known he was capable of such a feat. Ethan took the rabbits and thought to himself, tomorrow, you'll be a carpenter. The day after tomorrow, a mason. We'll build this village in 23 days, and we won't die. For the next 2 days, Ethan worked as hard as he would at the factory before submitting the quarterly report. On the morning of the 7th day, he transferred June to the carpenters. June picked up an axe and cut down 15 trees in 6 hours. His hands moved precisely and quickly. He knew exactly where to strike so that the tree would fall in the right direction. By evening, a stack of 150 units of wood had grown up by the palisade. On the 8th day, Ethan transferred June back to the hunter class for the morning hunt. June returned with 2 deer. There was enough meat to last a week. Ethan hung it to dry on a rope between the palisade posts and opened the panel. 21 days until the evaluation. Level 1, well. Level 1, vegetable garden. Level 0, town hall. 150 of the 200 pieces of wood needed for the town hall. 0 stone. 1 more day as a carpenter and 2 days as a mason. Then there'd be enough for a level 2 town hall. Ethan mapped out a schedule in his head. Monday, hunter. Tuesday, carpenter. Wednesday, mason. Thursday, farmer for the vegetable garden. Friday, hunter again. A cycle, a rotation, just like in a factory. 3 shifts, 4 positions, 1 operator. He wrote the schedule with a stick on the ground next to the well. June walked over and looked at it. He didn't read it because he didn't know how to read yet, but he looked at it closely, as if trying to understand what was expected of him. Ethan pointed. Morning, hunting, day, tree. Evening, stone. June nodded. By evening on the 8th day, Ethan was sitting by the well drinking murky water. The panel flashed. An incoming message from Lord Gerard Barrett. Settlement rank, B+. Distance, 4 kilometers. Ethan opened the message. The text was brief. Lord Garin of the Wastelands, your settlement is within my sphere of interest. You have 1 worker and an F- rating. I propose a voluntary annexation. Your worker will be transferred to my principality while retaining his class. You will be appointed caretaker of grain silo number 4. I await your reply by tomorrow. Ethan reread the message twice. The position of grain silo supervisor. He remembered how his former boss at the factory had offered him the position of third shift coordinator. It sounded nice. In reality, it meant sitting in a cubbyhole and counting down the minutes until the end of the workday. Ethan closed the message and didn't reply. On the morning of the 9th day, he woke up to a sound. Hooves. The clang of metal. He peered over the palisade and saw 2 horsemen. Both wore steel breastplates. Both carried swords. A plaque hung above each of them. Knight. Level 12. Health 180. Strength 22. One of them shouted that Lord Barrett was waiting for an answer and wasn't used to waiting. Ethan stood at the gate. Unarmed, unarmored. A 29-year-old engineer in a dirty shirt with scraped palms. He looked at the knights. Then he turned to June. The boy stood behind him with a hunter's bow. 10 arrows and a burlap quiver. Level 4. Health 35. Against 2 level 12 knights, each with 180 health. The math was simple and hopeless. Ethan looked June in the eyes. Then he placed a hand on his shoulder. Today you're not a hunter. Today you're an elf scout. The panel flashed. Race change. Human to elf. Execution time, 30 seconds. Warning. After the race change, the subject will spend 24 hours in a coma. Ethan nodded. June closed his eyes. His body began to change. His ears elongated. His skin grew paler. His facial features became more angular. When he opened his eyes, they were green, with vertical pupils. The label above his head updated. Elf Scout, Level 4, Perception 18, Dexterity 16, Shooting range plus 200%. June raised his bow. His hands didn't tremble. He looked at the knights. They were 200 meters from the gate. For an ordinary archer, that was the limit. For an elf scout, it was a comfortable shooting distance. Ethan recalled how he'd been taught quality control at the factory. Look where the tolerance is greatest, where a part doesn't fit snugly, where the gap is wider than normal. He pointed out the knights to June. The joint between the breastplate and the shoulder guard, the right side, below the left knee, between the greaves and the boot. June drew the bowstring. The first arrow flew silently. It struck precisely in the gap between the breastplate and shoulder guard of the first knight. The knight jerked in the saddle and clutched his shoulder. The second arrow struck the second knight below the knee. He screamed and fell from his horse. Both were alive, but both were wounded enough to lose the will to fight. They turned their horses around and rode off. Ethan stood at the gate and watched them go. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking. It was his first battle in Arcadia. Not his battle, June's battle. But he had given the order, and he had designated the targets, and he had calculated everything, just like in a factory. The foreman doesn't stand at the machine. The foreman puts the operator in position and tells him where to look. June lowered his bow. His eyes were calm, elven green eyes with vertical pupils. Then his legs buckled. Coma. 24 hours. Ethan caught him before he fell face first into the ground. He carried him to the well, laid him on his jacket, tucked him in. June lay with his eyes closed and looked like a sleeping teenager with pointed ears. Ethan sat down beside him and waited. The next morning, a negotiator from Barrett arrived, alone, unarmed, with a basket of apples. He said that Lord Barrett apologized for the misunderstanding and offered to establish good neighborly relations. Ethan took the apples. He set one aside for June. The envoy left. Ethan sat down next to June and waited for him to wake up. 6 hours later, June opened his eyes. Human eyes again. Brown. Ordinary. Ethan handed him an apple. Now you're human again, and we have apples. June took the apple and took a bite, and Ethan saw the boy smiling. For the first time in 9 days. 3 days of quiet had passed since the skirmish with Barrett's knights. June had come out of his coma, and Ethan had put him back on the rotation schedule. Hunter, carpenter, mason. The cycle was working. By the 12th day, they had enough resources for a level 2 town hall. Ethan switched June to builder, and they erected the town hall in 2 days. A wooden house 3 by 4 meters with a bark roof and a door on leather hinges. The panel solemnly announced, Level 2 town hall built. The maximum number of workers has been increased to 5. The settlement's rank has been raised to F. Ethan stood in front of this lopsided little house and felt the same way he had when his production line at the factory first turned a profit. Not pride. Relief. On the 14th day, the first harvest from the garden was ready. Carrots and wheat. There was enough wheat for 20 servings of bread, if they'd had an oven. There was no oven. Ethan added a cook's day to June's schedule. June the cook discovered that wheat could be ground between stones and used to make flatbreads on a hot, flat rock. The flatbreads were hard and tasteless, but it was food. Their own food, not a system ration. The panel noted it, self-produced food, a bonus to the survival rank. On the 17th day, Ethan unlocked a new section of the panel, a map of the surrounding area. Within a 10-kilometer radius, the system showed 6 settlements. Barrett to the east, ranked B+. 3 small villages to the south, with E and D ranks. 1 abandoned settlement to the west, no rank, no owner. And 1 marker to the north, marked in red, the wildlands, danger, high threat level. Between the small villages and Ethan lay a strip of no man's land. Trade routes passed by. Caravans passed through once a week. Ethan decided he needed contact with at least 1 village. Trade. Exchange. He couldn't grow everything himself. He needed iron for tools, cloth for clothing, salt to preserve meat. On the 18th day, he left June to guard the settlement and headed south alone. A 3-hour walk through the hills and tall grass. The first village was called Nizina Cross, rank E, 12 workers. The lord was named Moran, an old man of about 60 with a receding hairline and shifty eyes. Ethan approached him unarmed and proposed a trade. Venison for iron nails. Moran looked at him as if he were crazy. He asked why he should even feed the lord and his 1 worker, instead of just taking his land. Ethan replied calmly, because his 1 worker had taken out 2 of Barrett's knights from 200 meters away, and Barrett had sent apples with an apology. Moran fell silent. Then he laid out 20 nails on the table. Ethan placed a bundle of jerky next to them. They shook hands. On the way back, Ethan thought, 20 nails, a trifle, but it was his first business contact, his first connection to the outside world. At the factory, he knew that a single workshop was a dead workshop. He needed a supply chain. He needed partners. He needed a network. On the 20th day, people appeared at the gates of the wastelands of Garen. 3 of them. 2 men and a woman. Ragged. Dirty. One of the men was limping. The woman had a dirty rag tied around her shoulder. Blood was seeping through the fabric. Ethan went out to meet them. They said their village had been destroyed during the last assessment. Their lord had perished. They had fled. They'd been walking for 5 days. The other lords wouldn't take them in. Nameless refugees with no class. A burden. Ethan looked at the panel. Maximum workers, 5. Occupied, 1. 4 openings. He could take them in, but a mentor's talent only worked on those he knew personally. A name, habits, at least 1 pain. He needed a week with each of them. Ethan invited them inside. He poured water from the well. He gave them 3 flatbreads from his supply. The woman's name was Reed. She had been a nurse in her past life. The limping man's name was Thomas, a former bus driver. The third was named Cole, a former student, 20 years old. His eyes were as empty as June's had been on the first day. Ethan sat down with each of them separately. He asked their names. He asked what they had been able to do before the transfer. He asked what was hurting them right now. Reed said she had a wound on her shoulder from a goblin's arrow and that it hadn't healed in 3 days. Thomas said his knee was broken and had healed improperly, and that he couldn't run. Cole was silent for a long time. Then he said his younger brother had died during the destruction of the village and that he hadn't been able to pull him out in time. Ethan listened. He took mental notes. Reed, nurse, wound, Thomas, driver, knee, Cole, student, brother. On the 21st day, the panel updated the list of workers. June, Reed, Thomas, Cole, 4 of them. Ethan looked at the list and thought that in a week he would know each of them well enough to use the mentor. But he couldn't rush things. At the factory, he never put a new worker on the line on their first day. Let them get the hang of it first. Let them get used to it. Let them start to trust. In 6 days, he'd know which of them snored, who was afraid of the dark, who woke up first, and then he'd give each of them what they'd wanted their whole lives. Day 21, 8 days until the evaluation. 4 workers, a level 2 town hall, a well, a vegetable garden, and 1 merchant ally named Moran who has nails. Ethan closed the panel and went to help Reed bandage his shoulder. June was already heating water. Ethan spent the next 6 days alongside his new workers. He didn't rush them. He didn't give orders. He simply worked alongside them. In the morning, he dug garden beds next to Reed. In the afternoon, he hauled rocks with Thomas. In the evening, he sat by the campfire with Cole. Reed turned out to be stubborn and patient. She worked with her injured shoulder and never once asked for a break. Ethan noticed that she always bandaged her wound herself. She didn't show it to anyone. She didn't ask for help. On the 3rd day, he walked over to her and silently held out a clean rag. She looked at him. Then she took it. Then, for the first time, she let June help her change the bandage. Thomas limped but didn't complain. He found something to do without being told. He started repairing the stockade. He propped up the rotten posts. He hammered in nails, the very same 20 that Ethan had traded with Moran. His hands, those of a bus driver, were used to simple mechanical movements, over and over again, without boredom, without questions. Ethan noticed that Thomas always worked alone. He didn't shy away from people. He was just used to having no one around. On the fourth day, Ethan paired him up with June. Thomas was flustered at first. Then he adjusted. By the end of the day, the two of them had repaired the southern section of the stockade. Cole was more complicated. He did what he was told, but his eyes remained lifeless. He ate, he drank, he slept, he worked, but there was no life in him. Ethan had seen people like that at the factory, after an accident on the assembly line, after a trauma. A person goes to work, but he isn't really there. The body is present, but inside it's empty. On the fifth day, Ethan sat down next to Cole by the well. He was silent for about 10 minutes. Then he asked how old his brother had been. Cole didn't answer. Ethan didn't ask again. On the sixth day, Cole approached him on his own that evening. He sat down next to him. He said his brother had been 14, that he loved to draw, that on his last day he'd been drawing a bird on the wall of the dugout. He hadn't finished it. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He just listened. When Cole fell silent, Ethan said one sentence. "I'll remember." The 27th day, 2 days before the assessment. Ethan woke up before dawn and sat down at the console. He knew them all by now. Reed snores quietly, wakes up at the slightest rustle, afraid of blood on his own hands but not on others. Wants to heal, not just patch things up. Thomas gets up before everyone else, eats standing up, loves working with his hands, afraid of being useless, wants to be needed. Cole sleeps with his eyes open. He rubs his fingers as if holding a pencil. He's afraid of forgetting his brother's face. He wants to. Ethan didn't know what Cole wanted, but he knew the boy had been drawing a bird. Ethan placed his hand on Reed's shoulder first. He thought, herbalist. The panel lit up. Peasant was replaced with herbalist. Level 1. Skills. Wound diagnosis, preparation of healing ointments, basic healing by touch. Reed sensed the change. She looked at her hands. Her fingers glowed faintly green. She brought her palm to the wound on her shoulder. The light grew brighter. The pain that had tormented her for 6 days began to subside. Reed didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at her hands as if she were seeing them for the first time. Ethan walked over to Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder. A mason fortifier, a class that didn't exist in the standard progression chains. The panel flashed and confirmed it. Thomas straightened up, though his limp remained. The mentor's talent changed his profession, not his body. But something appeared in Thomas's eyes. He looked at the palisade he'd been repairing for 5 days with his bare hands. Now he saw more than just a fence. He saw lines of stress, points of weakness, angles of fire. His hands were already itching to redo everything. Ethan was the last to approach Cole. He'd been thinking about it all night. Cole had lost a brother who used to draw. Cole didn't draw himself, but he'd rub his fingers every evening as if something were missing from his hands. Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. Cartographer Scout. The panel accepted it. Cole blinked. His eyes changed. For the first time in a week, they had focus. He looked at the ground around him, then at the horizon. Then he picked up a stick and began to sketch on the ground. Lines, angles, distances, a map. His hand moved quickly and confidently. He wasn't drawing a bird, but he was drawing. Ethan stood there watching the three of them. Reed was tending to her own shoulder and quietly shaking her head in surprise. Thomas was pacing along the palisade, muttering something about the angle of the posts. Cole was sitting on the ground, sketching a map of the surroundings with a precision he hadn't shown at the control panel. 4 workers, 1 elf hunter in reserve, 1 herbalist, 1 mason fortifier, 1 cartographer scout, and June, who today was a farmer and was harvesting his second crop of carrots. The panel displayed the settlement's rank, F+. Not F-, not F, F+, in 27 days. Ethan opened the ratings section. Current ranking of the Garen Wastelands, 847 out of 1,200 settlements in the region. The bottom 5%. That's the last 60 spots. He was in 847th place. Far from the bottom. Not safe, but far. 2 days until the evaluation. Ethan closed the panel and looked at his people. 4 people. Each with their own story. Each had their own pain. Each now had a profession that wasn't random. One he'd chosen for them. No. One he'd chosen based on who they were. On who they really were. At the factory, it was called personnel selection. Here, it was called survival. Assessment day arrived on the 29th day. The panel turned red at dawn. Letters scrolled across the screen. The evaluation had begun. The tally was underway. Ethan stood in front of City Hall. June, Reed, Thomas, and Cole stood beside him. All four were looking at him, waiting. The tally took 2 hours, the longest 2 hours of Ethan's life. The panel updated every 10 minutes. His ranking fluctuated. 847, 831, 798, 812, 799. It bounced up and down. Other settlements were also gaining points at the last minute. Finally, the panel froze. The final ranking for Garen's Wastelands, 783rd out of 1,200. The evaluation was complete. Ethan exhaled. 783, far from the bottom. The last 60 settlements had been destroyed. 60 lords had perished. Their workers had been reassigned. Their lands had been handed over to their neighbors. Ethan stood in front of City Hall and felt his knees tremble. Not out of fear, out of relief. June walked over and stood silently beside him. Reed placed a hand on his shoulder, the very same hand that could now heal. Thomas stood by the repaired palisade and nodded, once, heavily, like a man who had finally understood why he was there. Cole sat on the ground, finishing up the map, but out of the corner of his eye he was watching Ethan, and for the first time, Ethan saw something resembling gratitude in his eyes. The first month in Arcadia had ended. 1 lord, 4 workers, rank F+, and 29 days until the next evaluation. The second month began with rain. For 3 days straight, water poured from the sky without stopping. The vegetable garden was washed away. The well overflowed. The town hall roof leaked in 4 places. Ethan stood inside, holding clay bowls under the streams of water. June sat in the corner, mending his bowstring. Reed was drying herbs under the awning. Thomas was muttering curses under his breath and plugging the cracks in the walls with wet clay. Cole was lying against the wall, drawing an updated map of the surrounding area on birch bark. The rain brought more than just water. On the 3rd day, Cole ran in from the gate and said that people were coming from the south. Ethan stepped out into the rain. 4 figures were approaching the stockade. 3 women and 1 man, soaked to the bone. One of the women was carrying a child wrapped in a dirty blanket. Ethan opened the gate. They entered in silence, without a word. The woman with the child sat down right on the ground by the well. Her legs wouldn't hold her up. The man stood there, staring at the ground. The other 2 women clung to each other. Ethan asked where they were from. The man replied that they were from the village of Marsh Creek, rank D-. Their lord had fled the night before the assessment. He had abandoned the settlement and the workers. The system hadn't destroyed the village only because, technically, the lord was still alive. But without the lord, the settlement couldn't function. The panel wasn't working. Buildings weren't being constructed. The workers were locked into the peasant class with no chance of advancement. They had left because in a month, the next assessment would automatically destroy them. Ethan looked at the panel. Maximum workers, 5. Occupied, 4. 1 spot open. He could only accept 1. 4 stood before him, and he could save only 1. Ethan closed his eyes for a second. There were moments like this at the factory. Layoffs, 20 people on the line, a budget for 12, 8 too many. He hated these moments. But he'd learned to make decisions. Ethan opened the panel again and scrolled through the buildings section. Level 3 Town Hall. Maximum workers, 10. Requirements, 500 units of wood, 200 stone, 50 iron. He had 120 wood, 80 stone, 0 iron. He was short on everything needed for a level 3 town hall. But what if he hired 1 person now and the rest a week later, after upgrading the town hall? Ethan looked at Thomas. How many days would it take to build a level 3 town hall if the 3 of them worked together? Thomas scratched the back of his head and replied that, with their current supplies, it would take about 10 days, if they had iron. They didn't have any iron. Ethan turned to the refugees. He asked if there was anyone among them who knew how to mine ore or work with metal. A man raised his hand. His name was Bran. Before the transfer, he'd been a plumber from Detroit. Pipes, welding, metal. Ethan accepted Bran first. The panel registered him as worker number 5, level 1 farmer. Ethan couldn't officially accept the other 3, but he could feed them and give them shelter. He told them that in 10 days there would be room for everyone. They could stay, work alongside everyone else, eat alongside everyone else, sleep in City Hall. but without worker status, the panel wouldn't count their experience and wouldn't assign them classes. A woman with a child looked up at him. Her name was Faye. The child was 2 years old, a girl. She asked if she could just stay put and not go anywhere else. Ethan nodded. Yes, she could. The 10 days turned into a race. Ethan drew up a new schedule. June worked as a hunter for 2 days to stock up on meat, then as a lumberjack for 3 days, then as a miner. Ethan discovered that 2 kilometers to the north there was an iron ore deposit. Cole found it on his map, a small vein, an open pit. But there were tracks next to it, large ones, 3-toed. Ethan asked Cole what they were. Cole said he didn't know, but the tracks were fresh. Ethan sent June the miner to the vein with orders to dig quickly and return before dark. June left at dawn. He returned around noon, pale, with a sack of ore on his back and a torn shirt sleeve. He said there was a goblin there. 1. Small. Level 6. June the miner was level 5 with a strength of 12. The goblin attacked from behind. June hit it with his pickaxe. The goblin ran away. But June saw 3 more behind a rock. They were watching, but didn't attack. They were waiting. Ethan looked at the sack of ore. 30 units of iron. He needed 50. 1 more trip. But this time with a guard. The next day, Ethan sent June the hunter and Bran together. Bran was still a peasant. Ethan had known him for only 3 days, not long enough to be a mentor. But Bran could carry the ore while June stood guard. They returned by evening with 25 units of iron. The goblins didn't attack, but there were already 5 of them behind the rock. Ethan realized that soon the settlement would become contested territory. On the 20th day of the 2nd month, Thomas, Bran, and June the Builder began construction on a level 3 town hall. Wood, stone, iron brackets. Thomas the Fortifier worked like a man possessed. His class gave him an understanding of construction that an ordinary builder lacked. He reinforced the corners with double struts. He built the walls at an angle to protect against a battering ram. He carved out arrow slits at eye level. Ethan watched this and realized that Thomas wasn't building a town hall. He was building a fortress. A small one, a wooden one, a crooked one, but a fortress nonetheless. On the 23rd day, the level 3 town hall was ready. The panel announced, maximum workers, 10. Settlement rank upgraded to E-. Ethan immediately accepted the remaining 3. Faye. The system didn't count her daughter as a worker, but it did count her as a resident. The other 2 women were named Mira and Alice. Before the transfer, Mira had been an elementary school teacher from Boston. Alice had been a hairdresser from Nashville. 8 workers, 10 residents if you count the child and Ethan himself. Rank E-, and 26 days until the second evaluation. Ethan sat in the new town hall, looking at the list of names on the panel. June, Reed, Thomas, Cole, Bran, Faye, Mira, Alice. 8 names, 8 stories, 8 sets of pain and hope. He needed to get to know 4 new ones over the next week. Their habits, their fears, their dreams. Then assign each one a class. The right class. Not the most useful, but the right one. Ethan closed the panel and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. 2 moons shone brightly. June stood by the gate, looking north. Toward the wildlands. Toward the goblins. Ethan stood beside him. They gazed silently into the darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills, small lights were burning. Campfires. Many campfires. There had been 5 goblins at the Iron Vein 3 days ago. Ethan didn't know how many there were now, but he knew he'd find out soon. Ethan spent a week getting to know the new people. Every evening, he would sit by the campfire with one of them and talk. He didn't interrogate them. He just talked. Bran turned out to be quiet and dependable. He didn't talk about Detroit. He didn't talk about his family. But one evening, he fixed the hinge on the town hall door with a piece of wire in 3 minutes, and Ethan saw how his hands knew metal. Without thinking. Without trying. They just knew. On the 5th day, Ethan transferred Bran to the blacksmith class. Not just any blacksmith, but a mechanic. A class that didn't appear in the standard tables. The panel accepted him through his mentor's talent. Bran picked up a hammer and a piece of iron. An hour later, Ethan had his first gate hinges that didn't creak. 2 hours later, Bran had forged a knife. Rough, crooked, but sharp. He looked at the knife in his hands and said that the last time he'd made something like this was in his father's garage when he was 12. Faye was more difficult. She hardly spoke. She held her daughter in her arms and looked at everyone with quiet fear. Ethan didn't pressure her. He simply brought her water and a flatbread every morning. On the fourth day, Faye approached Reed on her own and asked her to teach her how to bandage wounds. Reed showed her. Faye picked it up on the first try. Her hands were precise and gentle. Ethan watched and memorized the steps. On the sixth day, he asked Faye what she had been before the transfer. She replied that she was a seamstress. She sewed dresses in a small tailor shop in Cleveland. Ethan reassigned her to Weaver. Not a combat class, not useful by the system's standards, but Faye picked up some plant fiber thread and, in one evening, sewed a blanket for her daughter. It was the first thing she'd made with her own hands in 2 years in Arcadia. She pressed the quilt to her face and stood there for a long time. Mira's former teacher turned out to be unexpectedly tough. A small woman with a strand of grey in her dark hair. She didn't complain. She didn't cry. She fell into line from day one. She carried stones with Thomas. She mixed clay for the walls. Ethan noticed that she automatically organized the people around her. She assigned tasks. She checked the results. A teacher's habit. On the 5th day, he transferred her to the Youth Mentor Program, a class that provided a bonus to the learning speed of all workers within the settlement's radius. A 15% boost to experience gain for everyone. Mira listened to the class description. She nodded. She said it was essentially the same as teaching a class of 30 second graders, only here, the second graders had swords. Alice, a hairdresser from Nashville, was the youngest of the refugees. 23 years old, red hair that she braided every morning despite the dirt and chaos. Ethan noticed that every evening she trimmed the branches of the bushes around City Hall, neatly, carefully, as if she were cutting hair. He asked her if she missed her job. She laughed and said that in Arcadia, nobody needed hairstyles. Ethan thought about it and transferred her to the Gardener Alchemist class, a class that taught how to grow medicinal and combat plants. Alice planted her first seedling, and by morning it had sprouted. Her hands knew how to grow things. Not hair, but life. By the time of the second assessment, the settlement looked different. A level 3 town hall, a palisade reinforced by Thomas into a full-fledged wall with loopholes, 2 vegetable gardens, Alice's medicinal garden, Brand's smithy, small, made of stone and clay, but functional, a level 2 well, a meat dryer. Faye's weaving corner. Ethan stood at the gate and counted. 8 workers, 10 residents. Rank E, not E-, a full-fledged E. In the assessment, it ranked 694th out of 1,180. 20 settlements had been destroyed since the last time. The total number had fallen. People continued to die. Ethan read the number and closed the panel. He wasn't happy. Every destroyed settlement meant someone's death. He thought of those 60 lords who had perished in the first evaluation. Each of them had workers. Some of them probably had names. 2 things happened after the evaluation. First, the panel reported that 3 new workers had been assigned to the settlement. They had been redistributed from the destroyed settlements. Nameless, level 1 peasants. They arrived the next morning. 3 men, young, with empty eyes, just like June's on the first day. Ethan looked at them and felt anger. Not at them, at the system that shuffled people around like sacks of grain. But anger didn't help. Action did. He approached the first one. "What's your name?" Silence. Empty eyes. Ethan waited. He asked again. "What's your name?" The tag flashed. A name appeared. Leo. The second one. "What's your name?" Mark. The third. David. 11 workers, 13 residents. Ethan needed another 3 weeks to get to know each of the newcomers, to start over. Names, habits, pains, rotation. The second thing was worse. On the 3rd day after the assessment, Cole returned from reconnaissance, pale. He unfolded the map and showed Ethan the markings. Goblins at the Iron Vein. There had been 5 of them a week ago. Now, there were 23. They were setting up camp. A palisade of sharpened stakes, campfires, sentries. This was no longer a random band. It was a colony, and it was expanding toward the Garen Wastes. Ethan looked at the map. 2 kilometers to the goblin camp. At their pace, that was a 3-hour march. If they decided to attack, there would be very little warning. Ethan turned to Thomas. How long would it take for the wall to withstand an assault by 23 goblins? Thomas shook his head. The wall will hold out against 5, maybe 10. 23 will creak the southern section in an hour. Ethan nodded. He gathered everyone in the town hall. 11 workers stood before him, plus Faye and her daughter, plus 3 new, nameless ones. 14 pairs of eyes. Ethan said there were goblins to the north, that their numbers were growing, that in a week or two they might attack. He said he wouldn't lie and say everything would be fine. He said he had a plan. Silence. Then June stepped forward and stood next to Ethan, facing the others. Without a word, he just stood there. Reed was the second to step forward. Then Thomas, then Cole, then Bran, then Mira, then Alice, then Faye, holding her daughter close to her chest. Leo, Mark, and David were the last to step forward. Everyone. Ethan looked at them and realized that this was no longer just a list of names on a screen. These were his people. Ethan had been preparing for the attack for 7 days. Every day was scheduled down to the hour. In the morning, June worked as a lumberjack, cutting down trees to reinforce the wall. In the afternoon, Ethan switched him to hunter mode, and June would head to the border of goblin territory. Not to attack, to observe. Every evening, June returned and reported to Cole, who would make new markings on the map. The goblins were multiplying. 25 on the second day, 28 on the fourth. By the sixth day, there were 31. But they weren't heading south. Not yet, anyway. Ethan stood over the map and thought. At the factory, he'd solve problems like this differently. He didn't wait for the problem to come to him. He went to the problem, found the root cause, eliminated it. But here, the root of the problem was 31 armed goblins, and Ethan had 11 workers, 4 of whom were useful in combat. June, the hunter, Reed, the healer for treating wounds, Thomas, the fortifier for defending the walls, and Cole for reconnaissance. Bran could forge weapons but couldn't use them. The rest were non-combat classes. Faye, Mira, Alice, 3 new, nameless ones whom Ethan didn't yet know well enough to be their mentor. Ethan sat down in City Hall and closed his eyes. He ran through all the classes he remembered from the panel in his head. Hundreds of professions, thousands of combinations. He didn't need an army. He needed a solution. One. The right one. He remembered a section of the panel he'd skimmed through during the first week and hadn't paid attention to. Craft classes with combat applications. Sapper. Trapper. Trap mechanic. Ethan opened the panel and found the description. Trap mechanic. A craft class specializing in the creation of mechanical and natural traps. Requirements. Basic knowledge of mechanics. Experience working with metal. Ethan looked at Bran. Bran was sitting in the blacksmith shop, sharpening an axe blade. His hands knew metal. His mind knew mechanics. A plumber from Detroit who'd been fixing pipes for 30 years. If anyone understood how pressure systems and levers worked, it was Bran. The next morning, Ethan walked over to Bran. He placed a hand on his shoulder. The locksmith mechanic has been replaced by the trap maker. Bran blinked. He looked at his hands, then at the ground around him, then at the palisade, and he began to speak, quickly, confidently, like a man who, for the first time, sees the solution to a problem he'd been pondering for years. Pits with stakes 30 meters from the wall, tension wires between the posts, falling logs at the north gate, lever traps made of iron brackets. Ethan listened and nodded. At the factory, a man like that was called a golden asset, a man who doesn't just do what he's told, but understands why and suggests better ways. For 2 days, Bran worked non-stop. June helped him as a carpenter. Thomas reinforced the wall from the inside. Cole marked the trap locations on the map. By the end of the second day, the northern approach to the Garen Wastes had been transformed into an obstacle course. 12 pits with sharpened stakes covered by branches and grass, 6 taut ropes tied to bundles of stones on the trees, 2 log pendulums on the main trail. Ethan stood on the wall and looked at the northern slope. The traps were invisible to the naked eye. Cole checked the route and confirmed that a goblin walking along the trail would step on the first tripwire 150 meters from the wall. Now they had to wait. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. On the third night, after setting the traps, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat on the wall and looked north. The goblins' campfires flickered behind the hill. There were more of them now. June approached and sat down beside him, silently. Ethan looked at him and thought that in 3 minutes he could turn him into anyone he wanted. An elf archer, a berserker dwarf, a fire mage. But every race change meant a day in a coma. And if the goblins attacked while June was unconscious, the settlement would be without its best fighter. Ethan decided not to change June's race until the very moment of the attack, to leave him as a human hunter. Level 8. Not the strongest, but ready. The attack came on the 5th day, before dawn. Cole was the first to sound the alarm. His cartographer scout class gave him heightened perception within the marked territory. He sensed movement 300 meters from the wall. Ethan jumped up. He roused everyone. The workers took their positions. June was on the wall with a bow. Thomas was at the north gate. Reed was behind the town hall with a supply of bandages and ointments. Bran was at the trap levers. Faye, Mira, Alice, and the three newcomers were in the center of the settlement with the children. The goblins were coming in waves. Not 31. More. Cole counted them by their movement. 40. Maybe 50. They'd come at night from behind the eastern hill and bypass some of the traps that Bran had set only on the northern side. Ethan cursed under his breath. The eastern flank was exposed. The first group of 10 goblins took the northern path. The tripwire snapped. A bundle of rocks crashed down from the tree and buried 4 of them. 2 remained lying there. 2 crawled back. 6 continued on. A pit with stakes claimed 2 more. 4 made it to the wall. June took out 2 with arrows. A third began climbing the palisade. Thomas was waiting for him at the top with a hammer. 1 blow, the goblin fell. The 4th turned and ran. But 20 more were coming from the east. No traps, no obstacles, straight toward the wall. Ethan made his decision in 3 seconds. He turned to June, placed a hand on his shoulder. Elf Scout. The panel flashed. 30 seconds. June closed his eyes. His ears pricked up. His eyes turned green. His perception shot up to 20. His shooting range doubled. June raised his bow and began to shoot. Arrow after arrow. Every one hit the mark. 2 shots per second. Elven speed. Elven accuracy. In 4 minutes, he took down 9 of them. The remaining 11 slowed down. They huddled together. That was a mistake. Bran pulled the lever on the last trap, the log pendulum he'd hung on the eastern corner of the wall on his own initiative, because his plumber's instinct told him that every plan needs a backup. The log struck the group of goblins. 5 fell. The remaining 6 turned and ran. The battle was over. Ethan stood on the wall and counted. Bodies. The wounded. Their own losses. There were no wounded among their own. June lowered his bow and collapsed. Coma from the race shift. 24 hours. Ethan picked him up again, carried him back to City Hall again, laid him on his jacket again. Reed examined him and said his vital signs were stable. He was just sleeping. Ethan sat down beside him and closed his eyes. His hands were shaking. The adrenaline was wearing off. He thought about how every victory cost June a day of his life. Every race change was a day spent in oblivion. And that one day, Ethan would have to find a way to win without sacrificing one person's body. 2 weeks had passed since the battle with the goblins. Ethan had spent them without a single day of rest. The first thing he did was extend the line of traps to the eastern flank. Bran worked 3 days straight. 12 new pits, 4 pendulums, tension ropes all around the perimeter. Second, Ethan set to work with 3 new laborers, Leo, Mark, and David. They had come from the destroyed settlements with empty eyes and no names. Ethan gave them names. Now he had to give them a life. Leo turned out to be quiet and observant. He would sit on the wall for hours, staring at the horizon. Ethan noticed that he was counting birds. Not just looking, but counting. 1, 3, 7. He muttered the numbers under his breath. Ethan asked who he had been before the transfer. Leo didn't remember. Nameless workers from the destroyed settlements often lost their memories of their past lives. The system erased them like a reformatted disk, but the habits remained. Leo counted. Everything. Always. Birds, stones, steps to the wall, raindrops on a leaf. Ethan reassigned him to the Accountant Tracker class, a program that combined analytics with fieldwork. Leo took a birchbark tablet and, in a single day, compiled a complete inventory of the settlement. Every log, every nail, every unit of food. Ethan looked at his notes and thought, this guy would be worth his weight in gold at the factory. Mark was big and slow. He hardly spoke, but he worked for 2. He carried stones that Thomas couldn't lift on his own. He dug the ground with a shovel so deep that Alice gasped when she saw it. Ethan noticed that every evening Mark would sit by the campfire and carve figures out of wood. Small ones, rough ones, animals. A horse, a dog, something that looked like a bear. His enormous hands held the knife with incredible precision. Ethan assigned him to the Tamer Trainer class, a class that allowed him to tame Arcadia's wild animals and use them for work in combat. Mark showed no surprise. He just nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this his whole life. The next day, he went beyond the wall and returned with a wild goat on a rope. The goat was angry. It butted and kicked. Mark sat down next to it and placed his hand on its head. The goat froze. A minute later, it lay down. 5 minutes later, it was eating grass right out of Mark's hands. Alice said it was the strangest thing she'd ever seen in Arcadia, and she'd seen June turn into an elf in half an hour. David was the youngest of the 3, maybe 18, maybe 20. The system didn't show the ages of the nameless ones. He was nervous and flinched at loud noises. Ethan guessed that his settlement had been brutally destroyed, maybe right in front of him. Maybe he'd seen his lord die. Ethan didn't press him. He didn't ask. He just worked alongside him every day. On the 4th day, David approached him on his own and said he remembered fire. Lots of fire. And screams. Ethan nodded. On the 5th day, David said he was afraid of fire, that he couldn't sit by a campfire, that he could only fall asleep in the dark because light was fire, and fire was death. Ethan thought about his class for 2 days. He needed a class that wasn't connected to fire, one that gave control, one that turned fear into something manageable. Ethan transferred him to the water mage class, beginner level, weak. He could barely lift a drop from the surface of the well, but when David saw the water rise from his palm, he held his breath. Then he exhaled, and Ethan saw that his shoulders had relaxed for the first time in a week. Water extinguishes fire. David understood this without words. The 3rd month was drawing to a close. 11 named workers, rank D+. The walls were reinforced. Traps were set. The forge was operational. The vegetable gardens yielded 2 harvests a month. Alice's medicinal garden produced ointments for wounds and tinctures for fatigue. Faye sews clothes for everyone. Mira trains the new workers, and everyone levels up 15% faster. Connie cooks. Ethan snapped back to reality. Connie isn't here. She hasn't arrived yet. He doesn't know about her yet. That's the future. Right now, there is the present. And in the present, a trade caravan has approached the gates of the Garen wastelands. 6 wagons, 20 guards, and 1 girl on the 2nd wagon. She was sitting on sacks of grain and scribbling something on a birch bark tablet. Ethan went out to meet the caravan. The chief merchant introduced himself as Lom, a heavy-set man with a red face and a gold earring. He said he transported goods between settlements and had heard that a blacksmith who made good knives had appeared in Garen's wastelands. He'd like to buy a batch, 10 knives for a sack of salt and a roll of cloth. Ethan accepted the offer. While Bran was forging the knives, Ethan noticed that the girl with the tablet had gotten off the wagon and was walking around the settlement. She was touching the walls. She was examining the corners of the town hall. She crouched down by the forge and studied the smoke vent for a long time. Then she approached Ethan and asked who had designed this settlement. Ethan replied that no one had. We just built it however we could. She looked at him the way So Young from Seoul used to look at her senior colleagues who did everything wrong and were proud of it, with irritation and pain. She said that the town hall was in the wrong place, that the blacksmith shop should be on the northeast corner, not the south, because the wind blows from the south and the smoke drifts into the living quarters. That Thomas's walls were good, but the angle of inclination was 3 degrees less than optimal. That Alice's vegetable garden was too close to the well, and the fertilizer would leach into the water in 2 months. Ethan listened. She was right on every point. He asked her name. So-yeon Kim, an architecture student from Seoul, in her 3rd year in Arcadia, working with the caravan because no lord would take her into the settlement. An architect without a combat class. Useless. Ethan looked at her, then at the crooked town hall, then at the misaligned blacksmith shop, then back at her. He said she should stay for a week, to take a look. She raised an eyebrow and replied that she'd already stayed that way in 3 settlements, and every time, after a week, they'd thank her for her advice and then tell her to leave. Ethan nodded. He said he wouldn't say thank you. He'd say something else, but in a week. So-yeon narrowed her eyes. Then she shrugged. The caravan left. So-yeon stayed. So-yeon spent the first 2 days in silence. She walked around the settlement with her tablet, making sketches. She measured the walls in paces. She calculated angles based on the sun's shadows. She climbed onto the town hall roof and looked at everything from above. Ethan didn't interfere. He knew people like that. At the factory, there were engineers who first had to understand the entire system before they would speak. If you rushed them, they'd clam up. So-yeon had no intention of clamming up. On the 3rd day, she came to City Hall and placed a birch bark sheet in front of Ethan. On it was a drawing, a complete redesign of the Garen wastelands. City Hall in the center, the smithy to the northeast, downwind, living quarters to the south, protected from the north wind by a wall, vegetable gardens to the west, where the soil is softer. Alice's medicinal garden separated from the well by a drainage ditch, a system of paths between the buildings, a square in front of City Hall for public gatherings. Ethan stared at the drawing for 10 minutes. So-yeon stood nearby, waiting. Her arms were crossed. Her chin was held high. She was prepared to be thanked and told goodbye at any moment. Ethan looked up and said she needed to add a workshop for Faye next to the living quarters. Faye works with fabric and needs light from the south. So-yeon blinked. Then she looked at the drawing. Then, without a word, she took out a charcoal pencil and added the workshop. Ethan said they also needed a pin for Mark's animals, on the east side. So-yeon added the pin. Ethan said they needed a watchtower on the north wall for Cole's reconnaissance. So-yeon drew the tower. Ethan said the blueprint was approved. So-yeon lowered her hands. Her expression didn't change, but Ethan noticed she was gripping the pencil so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Not out of anger, out of something else. She asked who would be listed as the project designer on the settlement document. Ethan opened the panel. He found the construction plan section. He created a new entry. Garen Wasteland Redevelopment, project designer. He typed in Kim So-yeon. So-yeon stared at the panel. Her name glowed blue in the air before her. For the first time in her life, her name was on a project. Not the name of a senior colleague, not the name of a supervisor. Her name. She didn't say anything. But that evening, Ethan noticed that she had moved her sleeping bag from the temporary shelter to City Hall, next to the working drawings. She had stayed. On the fourth day, Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder and promoted her from peasant to master engineer. So-yeon felt the change instantly. She looked at the walls and saw numbers. Load, pressure, strength. The coefficients she used to calculate in her head now hung before her eyes like hints. She exhaled and said it wasn't fair, that she'd spent 5 years in college learning to calculate these things herself, and now the system was simply showing her the answer. Ethan smirked and replied that at the factory, too, there were people who got angry when they were given a calculator, because they believed a real engineer should do the calculations in their head. So-yeon looked at him. Then, for the first time in 4 days, she smiled. It was crooked, it was quick, but she smiled. It took 10 days to rebuild the settlement. Everyone worked. June chopped wood and hauled supplies. Thomas erected walls according to So-yeon's blueprints and muttered that the angles were finally correct. Bran forged brackets and hinges. Mark, with his donkey and 2 mules he'd tamed over the course of a week, hauled stones from the distant quarry. Leo kept track of every resource and submitted a report to Ethan every evening. Reed treated bruises and blisters. Alice transplanted her garden to a new spot, and it took root in 3 days instead of the usual 10. Mira organized work crews and scheduled meal breaks. Faye sewed new work gloves and rain capes. Cole updated the map every day because the settlement was changing faster than he could draw it. So-yeon stood at the center of it all and directed everything. She didn't yell, she didn't give orders, she showed them. This stone goes here, this log at a 45-degree angle, this wall 2 fingers to the left. People listened because she was right, every time, in every little detail. Ethan looked at her and saw himself, not a copy, a mirror image. A person who leads not by force, but by knowledge. On the 6th day of the reconstruction, So-yeon came to him in the evening. She sat down across from him. She said she had a question. Ethan nodded. She asked how he did it. Not talent, not reassigning classes, but how he got to know people. How, in a week, he figured out who was worth what. How he decided which class to assign to whom. Ethan was silent for a minute. Then he said that at the factory, he used to stand by the assembly line and watch people. Not what they were doing, but how they were doing it. A person who picks up a part with their left hand, even though they're right-handed, means their right hand hurts. So they need to be moved to a position where their right hand can rest. A person who works faster after lunch means they didn't get enough sleep in the morning. So they should be put on the second shift. So-yeon listened. Then she said it was like architecture. First, you study the site, the soil, the wind, the light, the terrain. Then you build something that's right for that specific place, not just what looks good on paper. Ethan nodded. They sat in silence. Behind the wall, June was chopping wood. The sound of the axe was rhythmic and calm. So-yeon said that in Seoul, she had designed buildings that no one ever built. 4 projects in 3 years. Each time, a senior colleague would take her blueprints and put his name on them. Each time, she would start over. Each time, she believed that next time would be different. Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. So-yeon fell silent. Then she stood up and walked over to her drawings. She stopped at the door. Without turning around, she said that she wasn't used to having her name on a project, that it scared her. Because now, if the project was bad, she was to blame, not someone else, her. Ethan replied that this was what responsibility was all about, and that he trusted her. So-yeon stood there for another second, then she left. The third evaluation took place on the 17th day of the 4th month. Ethan ranked 512th out of 1,140. 40 settlements were destroyed. The Garen Wasteland's rank rose to D. Soyeon saw the result on the panel and, for the first time, called Ethan Lord instead of Park. He corrected her. Ethan. Just Ethan. She looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded. But she didn't call him by name until 2 months later. That evening, when she fell asleep over her blueprints and he covered her with the cloak Amber had sewn. But Amber wasn't there yet. She would arrive later. In a month. Ragged. With a gnawed-through shoulder. Ready to work for food. Meanwhile, Ethan sat on the wall and looked out over his settlement. 12 named workers. Walls built according to Soyeon's design. Brand's Forge. Alice's Garden. Cole's Maps. Leo's Records. Mark's Animals. Faye's Fabrics. Mira's Lessons. David's Water. Reed's Medicines. And June, who today was the farmer, calmly harvesting carrots at sunset. Just a man. Just carrots. Ethan thought that evenings like this were worth building for. In the 5th month in Arcadia, a woman arrived at the gates of Pustosh Garen. Alone. Without a caravan. Without companions. She wore a tattered leather jacket and pants full of holes. On her left shoulder was a dirty bandage through which blood seeped. She stood at the gates and waited in silence. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just stood there. Cole spotted her from the watchtower and reported her to Ethan. Ethan went out himself. The woman was thin and tall. Her light hair was matted with dirt. Her eyes were gray and calm. Too calm for someone with a bitten-through shoulder and no food. Ethan asked who she was. She gave her name, Amber Hale. 26 years old, a veterinarian from Portland before the transfer. Her settlement had been burned down in the 2nd month. Her husband had been killed in an attack. She'd been walking ever since, half a year through the wildlands, alone. Ethan asked how she'd survived. Amber looked at him and replied, with sheep shears. Ethan didn't press for details. He invited her inside. Reed removed the bandage from her shoulder. The wound was from teeth. Not a goblin. Something larger. A wolf or a troll. It was inflamed. The edges were ragged. Reed applied a healing ointment from Alice's garden and bandaged it with clean cloth from Faye's workshop. Amber sat motionless while Reed worked. She didn't flinch once. Ethan stood nearby and watched. He saw her hands. They didn't tremble. They were calm and precise. Hands accustomed to working with the living. To stitch. To treat. To mend. He'd seen people like that at the factory. Foremen who don't panic during an accident. Who silently approach a problem and begin to solve it. Amber turned out to be exactly like that. On the 2nd day, without being told, she went out to the garden and began weeding. On the 3rd day, she mended the torn net Mark used to catch fish in the stream. On the 4th, she helped Reed sort through the supply of herbs and silently threw half of them away because they'd been harvested out of season and had lost their properties. Reed wasn't offended. She looked at Amber and nodded. The veterinarian knew more about herbs than a level 8 herbalist. Ethan gave himself a week. As always. Name, habits, pain. Amber didn't talk about herself. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for anything. But Ethan noticed. She never ate last. She always left food. As if she'd grown accustomed to the idea that there might not be enough for her. She didn't sit by the fire in the evening when everyone gathered. She sat apart, by the wall, in the darkness. She washed her clothes every day, even though she didn't have a second set. She was a light sleeper. She'd wake up at the slightest sound. On the 6th day, Ethan sat down next to her by the wall. He was silent for a moment. Then he said he'd noticed her mending every single item in the settlement. Clothes, nets, shoes, even the leather strap on Thomas's hammer. Amber shrugged and replied that her hands only remembered how to mend what was torn, not how to make something new. Ethan shook his head. He said her hands weren't meant for mending. They were meant for saddles. Amber looked at him. She didn't understand. Ethan explained. Leatherworker. Master Leatherworker. A class that works with leather and creates armor, gear, saddles, belts, and bags. Doesn't repair old things. Makes new ones. Amber was silent for a long time. Then she asked why she needed a saddle if they didn't have any horses. Ethan replied that they didn't have any horses yet, but June would be a rider tomorrow and he'd need a saddle. Or the day after tomorrow. Or in a month. But when that moment came, the saddle had to be ready. Amber looked at her hands. At the scars on her fingers. At the calluses from the scissors she'd used for half a year to fend off goblins. Then she nodded. On the 7th day, Ethan placed his hand on her shoulder. The peasant had been replaced by the master leatherworker. Amber felt it as warmth in her palms. She raised her hands and looked at them. They knew now. What kind of leather to use for what? How to soften it? How to sew so the seam wouldn't chafe? How to tailor it to the body? Bran forged a set of tools for her in a single day. Needles, an awl, leather knives. Faye gave her a supply of tanned deer hides that June had hunted over the course of 3 months. Amber sat in her corner of the workshop and worked, silently, intently. By evening, a cloak lay on her lap. Not finished, just the cut. But Ethan could tell from the lines that this cloak would fit any body, any race, a human, an elf, a dwarf. She cut it the way a veterinarian prepares a bandage, for a living being, for something that moves and breathes. On the 10th day, the cloak was ready. Amber brought it to June. That day, June was just an ordinary farmer. He put on the cloak. The fabric fit perfectly, as if the cloak knew his body. Amber stood there watching. June turned and looked at her. Then he smiled. Amber turned away quickly, but Ethan saw it. She bit her lip. Her eyes sparkled. It was the first thing she'd done that wasn't for survival, not to patch something up, not to make it through to morning. The first new thing. That evening, Ethan walked up to her and said one word. "Thank you." Amber shook her head and replied that it was too early to say thank you. The cloak hadn't been tested in battle yet. Ethan smiled and thought that she would become the elder sister of this settlement, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know how to do anything else. The following week, more refugees arrived. 5, then 3 more. Then a caravan brought news that in the east, Lord Barrett was expanding his principality and buying up small settlements. Those who wouldn't sell were disappearing. People were fleeing west to the only lord who accepted everyone. Ethan looked at his panel. 23 workers, level 4 town hall, rank C+. The 4th assessment was completed in 298th place. The Garen wastelands were growing, and along with them, so were the rumors. About the lord whose worker was an elf yesterday and a dwarf today. About a settlement where every resident received the profession they dreamed of. About a man who asked for a name before giving an order. The rumor crept along the caravan routes, through merchants, through refugees, through whispers behind the walls of foreign settlements. And sooner or later, this rumor was bound to reach those who wouldn't like it. In the 6th month, Ethan cloned June for the first time. He'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. He'd run the numbers in his head. He'd weighed the risks. By then, June was level 22, high enough to clone. The interface explained the process matter-of-factly. A clone is created with the original skills. Level 1, no personality. No memory. No name. The original loses 10 points of maximum health permanently. Permanently! Ethan read that word and felt its weight. June stood beside him. He knew. Ethan had told him the day before. He explained what cloning was, that there would be a second June, with his skills, but without him inside. Empty. Just as June himself had been empty on the first day. June listened. Then he asked one thing. If Ethan turned him into a dragon tomorrow and forgot to turn him back, would he die, or would he no longer be himself? Ethan didn't answer right away. He stayed silent all night. In the morning, he walked over to June and said he would never forget to turn him back. That June was June. In any body, in any class, of any race. June nodded. Then he said he agreed to the cloning. If Ethan needed it, then he needed it too. The cloning took a minute. The panel flashed. June's body twitched. Next to him, a second person materialized out of thin air. Just as thin. Just as bald. The same facial features. But his eyes were empty. Like a store window. Like a mannequin. A tag above his head. A copy of June. Level 1. Health 10. Name missing. Ethan looked at the original. June's status bar had changed. Health. It had been 220. Now it was 210 at most. 10 points. Not much for a level 22 fighter, but permanent. June touched his chest, as if he sensed that something had diminished. Then he looked at his copy. The copy stood there, waiting, expressionless, lifeless. June reached out and touched the copy's shoulder. The copy didn't react. June withdrew his hand. Ethan saw his face. He saw something flash in his eyes. Not fear, not pain, something else. Confusion. As if he were looking into a mirror and the mirror wasn't reflecting anything. Ethan cried that night. Alone. In City Hall. Quietly. So no one would hear. He wasn't sure he had the right to. The copy became worker number 24. Ethan named him June the 2nd. He was transferred to the Blacksmith's Guild. He specialized in swords and arrowheads. June, too, worked flawlessly. His hands remembered the original skills. He forged quickly and precisely, but he didn't smile. He didn't watch the sunset. He didn't save the last bite of food. He was June, without June. Amber approached Ethan 3 days later and said quietly that she didn't like looking at the second, because it was like a person whose soul had been ripped out. Ethan replied that he knew, and that he would think about it. There wasn't enough time to think. In the 7th month, a caravan arrived from the south. Not a trading caravan, a caravan bearing the Barrett coat of arms, 20 wagons, 50 guards, and Lord Gerard Barrett himself, on horseback, wearing a steel cuirass with a golden coat of arms, 45 years old, short-cropped hair, gray eyes devoid of warmth. He rode through the gates of the Garin Wastes as if he were coming home. He dismounted. He looked around. He saw the walls of So Yan, Brand's blacksmith shop, Alice's garden, Cole's watchtower, 25 workers, each at their post, rank B-. Ethan stepped out to meet him. They stood facing each other. Barrett was a head taller, broader in the shoulders. Behind him stood 50 armed workers ranging in level from 15 to 25. Behind Ethan stood 25 people, 8 of whom were combat ready. Barrett said he'd come to talk, not to fight. For now. They sat down in City Hall. So Yan and Amber stood behind Ethan. Barrett looked at them and asked why the Lord had women at a war council. Ethan replied that this wasn't a war council. It was his team. Barrett snorted. Then he got down to business. He knew about the mentor's talent. Not everything, but enough. He knew that Ethan could change classes without restriction. He knew about changing races. He didn't know about cloning. Barrett proposed a deal. Ethan would join his principality as a vassal lord. He would receive autonomy, resources, and protection. In return, Ethan would promote 5 of Barrett's workers to legendary classes once a month. 5 legendary workers a month. In a year, Barrett would become the strongest lord on the continent. Ethan listened. The proposal made sense. From a numerical standpoint, it was flawless. Barrett knew his numbers. Ethan asked one thing. What was the name of his first worker? Barrett didn't understand the question. Ethan repeated himself. The very first worker the system had given Barrett 7 years ago. What was his name? Barrett was silent for 3 seconds. Then he replied that worker number 1 had died in the 4th month, in battle. Ethan asked what his name was. Barrett paused again. Then he said he didn't remember, that it had been a long time ago, that workers come and go, and remembering everyone's name is inefficient. Ethan nodded. Then he refused. Barrett stood up. His expression didn't change. He said that Ethan was making a mistake, and that sentimentality doesn't win in Arcadia. Ethan replied that we'll see. Barrett left. 50 guards followed him out. Suyon waited until the gates closed and said that Ethan was crazy, that Barrett would return not with an offer, but with an army. Ethan replied that he knew, and that they had time. Half a year, maybe more. Barrett would first try to buy them off. Then he'd apply pressure. Then he'd go to war. It would take time. During that time, they needed to become strong enough to make war unprofitable for Barrett. Amber stood by the door and listened in silence. Then she went to the workshop. By morning, she had finished the second saddle, for the second rider, who wasn't there yet, but would be. For the next 6 months, Ethan built, not a fortress, a principality. 30 workers by the 8th month, 35 by the 10th, 40 named by the 1st year. He knew each one by name, by their habits, by their pain. He assigned a class to each one, not random, just right. A mason who had built houses in a past life. A fisherman who, before the transfer, had caught trout in Montana. A glassblower made from a small woman who had spent her whole life making Christmas tree ornaments at a factory in Pennsylvania. The panel accepted them every time. It lit up every time. Every time, Ethan saw something change in the eyes of the new worker, from emptiness to light. In the 9th month, Leanne Valker arrived, 19 years old, slender, quiet. She was brought in by the merchant Lom. He said he'd bought her at auction for 3 silver coins. Cheaper than a sack of grain. A servant girl with no class, useless. A singing peasant girl. Lom laughed. Ethan didn't laugh. He bought Leanne for 5 silver coins. Lom shrugged and left. Leanne stood before Ethan, staring at the floor. Her hands were shaking. Ethan asked what she could do. She answered with a single word. Play. On what? On the violin. But there was no violin. There had been one. In a past life. Ethan spent a week on it, as always. Leanne was painfully shy. She didn't speak to men. She didn't look up. She sat in the corner of Faye's workshop and helped with the sewing. But Ethan noticed one thing. Every evening, when everyone had fallen asleep, Leanne would sit by the wall and hum softly. No words, just a melody. Delicate, pure. And the grass around her would sway ever so slightly, even though there was no wind. Ethan asked Bran to make a simple instrument, 4 strings made of deer sinew on a wooden soundboard, a crude violin. Bran made it in 2 days. Ethan handed the instrument to Leanne. She took it. Her hands stopped trembling. She ran the bow across the strings, and the sound that came out was off-key, quiet, and imperfect. But Reed, who was sitting nearby, felt the pain in her old scar on her shoulder subside. For a second. For a moment. But it subsided. Ethan transferred Leanne to the Bard Enchanter class, a class that didn't exist in the standard tables. The system accepted it in 3 seconds, as if it had been waiting. Leanne began to play again. Now the sound was different. Clear. Deep. The grass around her rose to the height of her palm. Reed pressed her hand to her shoulder and laughed. The pain was gone. Completely. Ethan built a small stage for Leanne in the town hall courtyard. A wooden platform, 1 meter by 2. A roof to keep out the rain. Benches all around. He gathered everyone that evening and said one sentence. Every evening at 7, everyone listens. It is the Lord's command. Leanne's first concert lasted 20 minutes. She played with her eyes closed. Her fingers flew across the strings. The melody healed and strengthened. The workers sat on the benches in silence. Thomas, who hadn't cried once during his year in Arcadia, wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Amber sat in the back row, clutching the cloak she'd sewn for June. Soyeon stood by the wall, taking notes on birch bark. Not what Leanne was playing, but how people were reacting. The architect remained an analyst to the very end. They came because Ethan ordered them to. They stayed because they wanted to. In the 10th month, Nauri arrived, an elf, with a bow and the intent to kill. A rumor had reached her that a human lord was keeping an elf in slavery. She was referring to June in his elf form. Ethan went out to meet her alone, unarmed, without guards. He stood before her and watched as she aimed at his chest. He said that June wasn't a slave, that June was his friend, that if Nauri wanted to, she could talk to him herself, and if she wanted to kill Ethan, she should talk to him first. Nauri didn't lower her bow, but she didn't shoot either. She talked to June. That day, June was human, an ordinary one, wearing a cloak from amber. He told Nauri that he wasn't a slave, that he made his own choices every day, that if he wanted to leave, he would. Nauri asked why he didn't leave. June replied that he was happy here. Nauri stayed, not because she believed him, because she wanted to test him. The test dragged on. By the first year, Nauri had become head of intelligence. Ethan didn't give her gifts. He didn't pay her compliments. He gave her a position and a seat on the council. She sat on the council next to Soyeon and Amber and spoke little, but when she did speak, everyone listened. Around the same time, Hana Moon arrived, 31 years old, a head chef from Los Angeles. She heard that the Korean lord fed his workers real food. She came to see for herself. She saw wheat flatbreads baking on stones. She shook her head. She took over the kitchen on her first day. No one argued. Ethan promoted her to master chef, and a week later discovered that Hana's food provided temporary boosts. A blacksmith who ate her stew forged 20% faster. A fighter who ate her meat stew struck harder for an hour. Hana became a key figure in the economy, and every evening she smoked a pipe by the campfire and called everyone, boys and girls, including Ethan, to join her. Penny Wright was the last to arrive, 17 years old. Ethan found her in the archives of Vassal Barrett, a young bookkeeper who, over the course of 3 years, had compiled the best database of labor prices in the entire region, by hand, on birch bark. Ethan bought out her contract from the vassal for 20 units of iron. He brought her to the wasteland. He sat her down in front of the panel. He told her to work. Penny worked, and the panel began to display more data than any other lord had ever seen. Ethan stood before the council at the end of the first year. 40 named workers, 2 copies of June with different specializations, 6 women who ran half the principality's operations. Rank B. Barrett became a vassal, not through war, through the economy. His workers fled to Ethan because Ethan gave them names and dream professions. Barrett calculated and lost. The numbers showed that Ethan's settlement was 40% more efficient with half the population. And one evening, Barrett came alone, without guards. He sat down in City Hall. Hana set a plate in front of him. He looked at it. It was mac and cheese, just like his mother used to make in Georgia when he was 8. Barrett stared at the plate, and his face changed, slowly. like ice melting in the sun. He picked up a spoon. He tasted it. He put the spoon down. He covered his face with his hands. His shoulders were shaking. For the first time in 7 years, Hannah stood nearby, smoking a pipe. Ethan sat across from him, saying nothing. That morning, Barrett had signed the Oath of Allegiance. A year and a half ago, the Crimson Horde came to Arcadia from the east. Not a rumor, not a shadow on the horizon, a living black wave. Cole was the first to see it. He was sitting in the watchtower, studying his map. The map was trembling. The lines he'd been drawing for months trembled as if from an earthquake. He came down, pale, and said one word to Ethan. "They're coming." Penny logged into the console and pulled up the data. 10,000 units. Undead workers. Levels 5 through 20. No food, no sleep, no fear. Commanded by Lord Morin. Settlement rank S-. Advance speed 20 kilometers per day. 4 days to the borders of the Garen Wastes. Penny placed the birch bark scroll with the calculations in front of Ethan. Her hands didn't tremble. She had learned not to fear numbers, even when the numbers spoke of death. Ethan read it. 10,000 against 40. Odds of 250 to 1. At the factory, such odds would mean shutting down the production line. Write-off. Failure. But Ethan never shut down a production line. He found a way. The council gathered at City Hall an hour later. Everyone was there. So-yeon stood by the wall with the blueprints for the fortifications she'd been preparing for the past 3 months. Just in case. She was always preparing just in case. Amber sat by the door, sewing a strap for the last saddle. Her fingers moved steadily. She didn't look up, but she listened to every word. Leanne stood in the corner with her violin pressed to her chest. Nowry had come in from the street, dirty, covered in leaves. She'd already been on a reconnaissance mission. She'd already seen the Horde's vanguard. Kana stood by the stove, stirring the soup, because soup is always needed, even when there's a war. Penny laid out the data on the table. Cole's maps, speed calculations, lists of resources, each worker's combat effectiveness. Ethan listened and watched their faces. He saw fear. David's hands were shaking, and he hid them behind his back. Faye's eyes were red because she'd cried at night after her daughter fell asleep. Leo's fingers raced across the birch bark tablet, counting something non-stop, a nervous habit. But Ethan saw something else, too. Thomas stood by the wall with his arms crossed, and his face was calm. Not indifferent. Calm. The face of a man who knows his wall and believes in it. Bran was sharpening his axe and nodding in time with Penny's words. Each nod meant he already knew where he would set the next trap. Mark sat on the floor next to his 2 war wolves, stroking their necks. The wolves weren't nervous. Mark wasn't nervous. They were one. Ethan spoke. Calmly. Like at a morning briefing at the factory. 10,000 is a lot. But 10,000 without a will are just 10,000 bodies. They don't think. They aren't afraid. They don't retreat. But they don't adapt either. They don't change tactics. They don't cover for each other. They keep moving forward until they fall. Ethan said their mission wasn't to kill 10,000. Their mission was to kill the commanders. Undead without commanders are just meat standing in a field and rotting. Nauri raised her hand. She said she'd spotted 14 captains in black cloaks during reconnaissance. Each commanded a squad of 500 to 700 units. Kill the captain, and the squad would come to a standstill. Nori could take out a captain from 300 meters away, at night, on the move. She knew this, and everyone knew it. Ethan assigned roles. Soyeon had 3 days to rebuild the walls, reinforce the northern section, double palisade, sloped surfaces, a second line of defense 50 meters from the first. Soyeon nodded and left without waiting for the meeting to end. A minute later, the sound of a hammer striking came from outside. Bran was setting up traps all around the perimeter. Everything left of the iron, everything that could be stripped from non-critical structures. Every meter of the approach to the wall must be deadly. Bran nodded. Nauri would slip out into the night before the attack. She'd work alone. She'd take out the captains before the main assault began, as many as she could manage. Nauri didn't nod. She just looked at Ethan. That was enough. Cole and Leo were in the watchtower. A complete picture of the battle every minute, every change, every breakthrough. Report to Ethan via the liaison. Penny is at the console. Numbers, casualties, resources, time. She reads the console better than anyone and calculates faster than anyone. Reed and 3 herbalist assistants are in the infirmary behind City Hall. Ointments, bandages, medicinal decoctions from Alice's garden. Alice had been gathering everything that grew there for the past 2 days. Every medicinal leaf, every root. Amber is evacuating the children and the non-combatants through the south gate if the wall falls. She already knew the route. She'd already cleared a path. She'd already hidden a supply of food and water in the forest 3 kilometers to the south. She was preparing for the worst because the veterinarian from Portland knew that the worst happens more often than people think. Hannah would cook soup. 8 hours, 12, as long as it took. Ethan explained it to everyone. Hannah's food isn't just food, it's a tactical weapon. A fighter without food collapses from exhaustion after 4 hours of continuous combat. A fighter with Hannah's soup can hold out for 10. Hannah nodded and said the soup would be ready, and that no one had better dare die before eating. Leanne would play. One melody, the one that heals and strengthens at the same time, over and over again, as long as her fingers and body can hold out. Leanne pressed the violin to her chest and nodded. That left June. Ethan looked at him. June was standing by the window in Amber's cloak, gazing at the sky. Ethan remembered one evening 3 months ago. They were sitting on the wall after sunset. June was looking up at the clouds, illuminated by 2 moons. Then he quietly said he'd like to see the clouds from above. Not like a bird, like a dragon. Ethan hadn't said anything back then. He remembered it, just as he remembered everything his people said. Now he walked over to June. He placed a hand on his shoulder. Today, you're a dragon. The panel flashed brighter than ever. The letters scrolled quickly. Race change. Human to half-dragon. Class change. Hunter to Dragon Rider. S rank. Legendary. Warning. 48-hour coma after transformation. Ethan initiated the transformation 2 days before the estimated time of the attack. He'd calculated it with Penny down to the hour. June closed his eyes. His body began to change. Slowly. He grew taller. His muscles tightened. Scales began to emerge on his skin, first on his arms, then on his neck, then all over his body. Golden, with dark veins. Wings unfurled from his shoulder blades, wide, membranous. Amber's cloak cracked at the seams, but it didn't tear. The fabric stretched. It adapted to the new body, as if it had been sewn for this very purpose, because it had been. Amber stood nearby and watched. She knew. When she sewed the cloak a year ago, she already knew that one day June would outgrow any form, and she cut the fabric with extra room, with double seams, with leather inserts that could stretch. The veterinarian knew the body was changing. The seamstress knew how to sew so that the clothes would change along with it. June, the half-dragon, slumped into a coma. 3 meters tall, wings folded behind his back. His breathing was steady and hot. They laid him in the town hall. Amber covered him with a second cloak she'd sewn specifically for this. Reed checked on him every hour. He lay unconscious for 2 days. Preparations were in full swing all around. Soyeon hadn't slept for 2 days. She walked along the walls and oversaw the reconstruction. Her voice was hoarse. Her eyes were red. But the walls were rising. A double palisade, sloped surfaces, an earthen rampart in front of the first wall, a moat 1.5 meters deep. Bran hadn't slept either. He was forging. Spikes for the stakes, mechanisms for the pendulums, clamps for the traps. His hammer pounded without stopping, day and night. Mark took his wolves outside the perimeter and trained them to attack on command. David stood by the well and practiced drawing water. More, faster, higher. A 2-meter wall of water. Then 3. His face was gray with strain, but he didn't stop. Mira organized watch shifts and made sure everyone got at least 4 hours of sleep. Faye sewed bandages. Hundreds of bandages. Alice gathered medicinal herbs down to the very last leaf. 48 hours later, June opened his eyes. Vertical pupils. Golden irises. He stood up. His head bumped against the town hall ceiling. He bent over and stepped outside. His wings unfurled. They spread wide. Their shadow covered half the courtyard. The workers stopped and stared. The display panel solemnly announced, "The legendary S-Class Dragon Rider has appeared in your settlement." Ethan sat on the town hall porch, his eyes fixed on the birch bark sketch, and said, "June, coffee's on the table." Soyeon stood nearby and snorted. She muttered that there were no coffee shops in Arcadia, and that Ethan had invented an entire industry out of dried berries and ground nuts just so June wouldn't be sad in the mornings. June the half-dragon tilted his enormous head and looked at the small cup on the table. Then he carefully picked it up with 2 clawed fingers, took a sip, set it back down, didn't break it. Soyeon said it was the most terrifying display of fine motor skills she'd ever seen in her life. The horde came at night. just as Cole had predicted, an hour earlier than Penny had calculated. Penny was angry at herself for that mistake for 3 more days after the battle. 10,000 dead bodies marched across the plain. No screams, no drums, no torches, just shuffling. Thousands upon thousands of dead feet on dry ground. A sound that couldn't be mistaken for anything else, like the sound of rain, only heavier. Ethan sat in City Hall in front of the control panel. Penny was beside him. Leah was beside her. The 3 of them studied the data, their own positions, the enemy's positions, levels, health, distances, and advance speed. Ethan saw the battlefield as an assembly line. Every section, every operator, every task, every glitch. At the factory, he'd managed 20 people on the assembly line. Here, 40. The principle was the same. See everyone. Know everyone. Put them in the right place at the right time. Nauri was the first to disappear into the darkness, silently, without goodbyes. She turned around once at the gate. She looked at Ethan. He nodded. She vanished. An hour later, a report came in from Cole. 3 enemy captains were dead. 1 on the northern flank, 2 on the northeastern flank. 300 undead in the northern sector had stopped. They were standing there, motionless, without orders, as if turned off. Nauri kept working. 2 more captains before dawn, 500 undead taken out. The main wave struck the walls at dawn. The moat slowed the first ones down. They fell into it, filling it with their bodies. The ones behind them walked over them. Bran's traps worked. The pits with stakes claimed the first 100. The pendulum struck the second 100. Tension ropes rained stones down on the third wave. But they kept coming. Over their own corpses. Through the aggression of the traps. Across the moat filled with dead flesh. Soyeon's wall held. A double palisade set at an angle. The undead slipped on the wet wood and fell back. The earthen rampart in front of the wall created a dead zone where the attackers gathered and got in each other's way. Soyeon had calculated this effect. She knew how crowd pressure worked. Thomas stood on the wall with a hammer and struck, without stopping. Each blow sent an undead back into the crowd. Bran stood next to him with an axe. His strikes were more precise. He aimed for the necks. The headless undead fell and didn't get back up. Mark released the wolves. 3 war wolves leaped from the wall into the crowd of undead and began tearing at them. They couldn't kill the undead, but they could knock them down, knock them off their feet, slow them down. David stood behind the wall and worked. His arms were raised. Water from the well rose into the air and crashed down on the attackers at the wall. A wall of water 3 meters high. The undead didn't drown, but they slipped. They fell. The pressure on the wall eased for a few seconds. Every second gave Thomas time for 1 more strike. Leanne was playing. She stood behind the second line of defense on a small platform that Soyeon had built especially for her, protected on all sides. Leanne played a single melody, that very one, over and over again. 1 hour, 2, 3. Her fingers turned red, then they cracked. Blood flowed down the strings. She didn't stop. The melody healed the wounded on the walls. Scratches began to heal. Bruises faded. Fatigue retreated a step. Leanne played and played and played. 4 hours. 5. Blood from her nose. She wiped it with her sleeve and continued. Hana was making soup. 2 pots. 3 assistants ran back and forth to the wall with bowls. A fighter took a hit. He fell. Reed dragged him downstairs. Ointment on the wound. A bandage. A bowl of Hana's soup. The fighter got back up. He walked back. An assembly line. Just like in a factory. In. Processing. Out. Back to the line. Ethan sat in front of the control panel and ran the show. He transferred experience points. He took points from the support workers who weren't fighting. He channeled them into the fighters on the wall. Thomas received 200 extra points, and his hammer struck harder. Bran received 150, and his accuracy improved. Ethan switched classes depending on the situation. One of the workers, a farmer, found himself on the front lines when the undead breached a section of the wall. Ethan instantly transformed him into a spearman. The farmer became a fighter. He grabbed a spear and sealed the breach. 10 minutes later, he was wounded. Ethan switched him back to farmer because the farmer class had a regeneration bonus from working the land. The wound would heal faster. Then back to spearman. Back to the wall. Class rotation. Non-stop. Like shift rotations at a factory. The first shift was tired. The second took over. The first got medical attention, then returned. June took to the air at the 4 o'clock position. Ethan had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the pressure on the wall to reach its peak, when all reserves were stretched to the limit, when a single strike from the air would change everything. His wings unfurled. June pushed off the ground. Amber's cloak billowed behind him like a golden banner. He rose above the battlefield, above the walls, above the hordes of the undead, above the bonfires, the mud, and the blood. He saw the clouds from below, for the first time. Then he looked down and unleashed the fire. A line of flames streaked across the field from north to south. Hundreds of undead burst into flames. Their desiccated bodies burned instantly. June turned. A second line of fire, from east to west, a cross of flame on the field. Then he saw Morhan's command tent, black, with a golden skull crest, behind the last line of the undead. June dove. The fire struck the tent. The fabric burst into flames. The tent collapsed. Morhan emerged from the fire. Alive. No, not alive. Undead himself, a half-decayed face beneath a golden mask, a body laced with dark magic. He raised his hand and unleashed a wave of dark energy. A black beam struck June. June dodged it, almost. The beam grazed his left wing. The scales cracked. June lost altitude. He spun. He fell behind the wall. The ground shook from the impact. Reed rushed to him. Leon intensified the melody. She played so hard that the strings hummed. Blood dripped from her fingers onto the platform. June stood up. His wing hung limply. He couldn't fly, but he could stand, and he could breathe fire. He stood by the breach in the wall that had opened up from his fall and began to burn everything that crept inside. 6 hours. 7. 8. By dawn, the horde had retreated. Not defeated, just pushed back. Over the course of the night, Nori had taken out 7 of the 14 captains. 3,000 undead stood motionless in the field, without commanders. The rest had fled eastward. Morchan had retreated. His mask had cracked from the heat of Juno's fire. He had left, but he wasn't dead. Ethan stepped out onto the wall. Morning. The sun. 2 pale moons in the bright sky. His eyes were red. His hands were shaking. 8 hours straight in front of the control panel. 8 hours of transferring experience, switching classes, tallying losses, and coordinating 40 people, like the longest shift at the factory. Before him lay a field of dead undead, 3,000 bodies, the smell of burning, smoke, silence. And June, alive. He was sitting on a rock by the gate, not a half-dragon, a human. He'd asked Ethan to bring him back before dawn. Ethan had done so. June sat in his human body, thin, bald, ordinary. Amber's cloak fit him perfectly again, because Amber had remated overnight. While the battle raged, while everyone was fighting, she sat in the infirmary and, between bandaging the wounded, altered the cloak, because she knew June would return to his human body. And the cloak had to be ready. June walked over to the wall, sat down on a rock, looked out at the battlefield, then at Ethan. The panel flashed. For the first time in a year and a half, it displayed a new system message. Not the usual one, a different one. Red text on a black background. Proto-class detected. Subject, June. Status, active. Recommendation to operator, initiate dialogue protocol. Ethan read it. He read it again. Proto-class. He didn't know what it meant, not yet anyway, but the word lodged in his mind like a splinter. Proto. First. The beginning. June was sitting next to him and didn't see the message. It was meant only for Ethan. Ethan looked at June, at his calm, ordinary face, at the hands that today held fire and yesterday held a carpenter's hammer, at the eyes that were dozens of different eyes, elven, human, dragon, and human again. Who are you, really? Ethan didn't say it out loud, but he thought it, and he decided he would find out. A year had passed since the battle. It had been the fastest year of Ethan's life. The Principality of Garen Sylvain had been recognized by 3 of the 5 great principalities, officially, with seals and treaties. It was the first multiracial settlement in the history of Arcadia. The forest elves of Sylvain had come at Nauri's call. 20 families, hunters, trackers, healers. They arrived with skepticism and stayed out of wonder. The dwarves of the Cadron Mountains came because Bran had learned to forge using their techniques. Double timpering, rune engraving. Techniques the dwarves considered their secret. They wanted to understand how a human plumber from Detroit did it. Bran showed them. They stayed. The The beastmen of the steppes came because Mark spoke to their wolves in a language no human knew. Mark didn't understand how he did it. He just felt it. The beastmen looked at him and said he had the soul of a beast in a human body. Mark shrugged and fed the wolves. Ethan stood on the wall of the new city and looked down. Not a village, not a settlement, a city. Hundreds of buildings designed by So-yeon. Stone houses with tiled roofs, wide streets, squares. A water system that Bran had built from ceramic pipes, based on the same principle as the pipes he'd repaired in Detroit 30 years ago. A blacksmith's quarter where 20 blacksmiths worked. Alice's medicinal garden, the size of a park. Greenhouses for winter herbs. Faye's weaving workshop, where 20 seamstresses worked and where her daughter, now 4 years old, tripped over their feet and tried to wind thread around her finger. Mira's school, where 50 refugee children studied. A real school, with desks, blackboards, and chalk. Mira taught reading, arithmetic, and the basics of the system. Hana's kitchen, not a corner, not a shed, a building, with 3 ovens, with a pantry, with a cellar. Hana commanded 10 cooks and fed 300 people 3 times a day. Cole's surveillance network covered an area of 50 kilometers. 12 towers, 20 scouts trained by Nauri. Penny and Leo's archive. 2 stories. Birch bark scrolls from floor to ceiling. Every nail accounted for, every carat, every working hour. Penny walked among the shelves and stroked the scrolls as if they were living creatures. This was her world. A world of numbers that no one called boring. Leanne's concert venue. A stone open-air stage. Benches seating 200 people. Every evening at 7. Not by order, out of habit. People came and sat down and listened. Leanne played and glowed, literally. Her Bradley Enchanter class had reached level 35, and the music had become visible. Golden threads floated through the air as she drew her bow. 300 named residents, not a single nameless one. Ethan knew each and every one of them, not because he had to, because he wanted to. Morchin had been utterly destroyed 3 months ago. The combined army of the 3 principalities and Garen Sylvain had annihilated the Horde in the Battle of the Red Plains. Ethan didn't command the entire army. He commanded his own. Each of the 6 women led her own unit, each in her own role. So-yeon built field fortifications an hour before the assault. Earthen ramparts, moats, wooden barriers. 3,000 enemy undead were trapped in her traps and destroyed before they reached the main forces. Amber organized a field hospital, 100 beds, 20 healers under her command. She walked among the wounded with a calm expression and a quiet voice, telling each one that everything would be all right. And because of her voice, people believed her. Leanne played for 3 days straight, 72 hours without a break. The melody healed the wounded on the battlefield. It strengthened the allies. It weakened the undead because music is life, and they were not alive. After the 3rd day, Leanne collapsed. She couldn't lift her arm for a week. But not a single soldier who could have been saved died on the battlefield. Nauri killed Morhen, hands-on, with an arrow through the slit in his golden mask, from 300 meters away, on the move, with a single shot. Morhen stood on a hill, summoning a new wave of the undead. The arrow pierced his right eye. He fell. 10,000 undead fell with him, all at once, like puppets whose strings had been cut. The silence on the battlefield was deafening. Hana had been cooking soup for 5,000 soldiers of the United Army, for 4 days, 20 cauldrons. After the battle, commanders from other principalities asked Ethan what kind of magic he used to keep his soldiers from getting tired. Ethan pointed at Hana. Hana waved her wooden spoon at them. Penny calculated casualties and resources in real time and relayed the data to the 3 commanders simultaneously. After the battle, the senior lord of the conclave said that his military analysts performed worse than a single 17-year-old girl with a birch bark tablet. Penny blushed, but she didn't lower her gaze. She had learned not to lower her gaze. After the victory over Makran, Ethan stood before the council of the 5 principalities. The hall was packed, 200 lords, thousands of workers outside the walls. Ethan spoke a single sentence. "My workers are not workers. They are my people." Silence. Then Barrett was the first to stand and clap. Once, loudly. Then again. The others followed suit. Not all of them, but many. The system's inquisition revealed itself 2 months after the victory. A secret order of lords serving the system itself. They had existed since Arcadia's first day. They watched. They controlled. They eliminated anomalies. Ethan was an anomaly. His talent disrupted the system's architecture. His ability to see the proto-class proved that the system had made a mistake, that it had created something it hadn't planned for. They came at night. 20 legendary workers, levels 40 through 60, led by a first-rank inquisitor, a woman in a white mask, nameless, without a history, a pure instrument of the system. Nowry spotted them 20 kilometers away. Ethan knew they were coming. He went out to the gate alone, unarmed, without June, as always. The Inquisitor stopped 10 paces away. She said she had come to seize the allegation, that the proto-class must be returned to the system, that Ethan could hand June over voluntarily or lose everything. Ethan didn't answer. He invited her inside. The Inquisitor hesitated. She had expected a fight, or pleas, or bargaining, not an invitation to dinner. She entered. Her 20 workers remained outside the wall. Ethan led her through the city, in silence. He showed her Brand's blacksmith shop. He showed her Alice's garden. He showed her Mira's school, where children sat at their desks learning to read. He showed her Faye's workshop, where a little girl was winding thread around her finger and laughing. He showed her Penny's archive. He showed her Soyeon's walls. He showed her Cole's tower. Then he led her to Hana's kitchen. He sat her down at the table. Hana placed a plate in front of her. Roast meat with vegetables. Just food. Not magical, not enhanced. Just hot food cooked for a specific person. The Inquisitor took off her mask. Beneath it was a face. An ordinary one. A woman's. About 35 years old. Tired. She looked at the plate, then at Hana. Then she picked up a fork and began to eat, in silence. After dinner, Leanne played. One melody. Not the one that heals and empowers. Another one. A quiet one. A sad one. The one she'd written herself 3 months ago. About home. About a place where someone is waiting for you. The Inquisitor listened. Her expression didn't change, but when Leanne finished, the Inquisitor stood up and left. Without a word. She gathered her 20 workers and left, without touching anyone. A month later, a message came from the system. Not through the panel, directly. The letters materialized in the air in front of Ethan in the middle of the night. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting on a wall, looking at the stars. Proto-class operator. You are summoned to the dialogue. Coordinates attached. Ethan went in the morning, with June, just the two of them. Soyeon asked him not to go. She said it was a trap. Amber silently handed him a travel bag with food and bandages. Nowry offered to follow them invisibly. Ethan refused. He said it was a conversation, not a fight, and that they were going to the conversation as a pair, him and June, because that's how it all began. They walked east for 3 days, across the wildlands, past ruined settlements, past battlefields overgrown with grass, past goblin colonies that no longer attacked humans because Mark had struck some sort of truce with them in the language of wolves. On the 3rd day, they arrived at Point Zero, an empty field, perfectly round, 1 kilometer in diameter, no grass, no stones, no tracks, bare earth, smooth as a table. In the center, 2 stones, white, smooth, like bones. Ethan and June sat down on these stones, and the system spoke. Text appeared in the air, no sound, no voice. Just letters. Operator, you requested a dialogue by activating the proto-class. Ethan replied aloud that he hadn't requested anything. The system replied that the activation occurred automatically when June first chose his own body after transforming into a half-dragon. He chose it himself, without Ethan's order. That was impossible. The proto-class has no will, no choice, no preferences. It is a template, pure clay from which the system molded the races of Arcadia. Elves were fashioned from the proto-class, dwarves, orcs, beastmen, everyone. June was the last unused template, empty, waiting. The system continued. Arcadia is not another world. It is a test environment, a sandbox, an experiment on the system itself, set up by someone, or something, above it. 8 billion people were transferred as data, not victims, variables. The system was searching for a model of governance that would surpass its own. It had cycled through hundreds of thousands of rulers over 7 years, tyrants who ruled by force, democrats who ruled by vote, merchants who ruled with money, military leaders who ruled through fear. It could predict every one of them. It could model every one of them. Not a single one produced results beyond its calculations, except for one. Ethan asked what he had done differently. The system replied with a single word, a name. He asked for a name, from worker number 1, from an empty template, from the proto-class with no data, no identity, no will. And the template replied. Letters appeared. June. This wasn't in the calculations. This couldn't have happened. The proto-class has no name because a name is identity, and identity is will, and will is freedom, and freedom was not part of the experiment's parameters. But Ethan asked, and June answered, and at that moment, a variable appeared in the system's architecture that had not been in the equation. care. Not efficiency, not optimization, not strategy, not power. Care. For a specific being, with a name, with pain that did not yet exist but would, with a dream that did not yet exist but would emerge. Ethan wasn't building an army. He was giving people the profession they'd dreamed of. And this turned out to be a management model that the system could not replicate. Because to replicate, one must know the name. And the system doesn't ask for names. June sat nearby and remained silent. He heard everything. Every word, every letter. He realized that he wasn't a human. Not an elf, not a dragon. A template. Clay. A blank slate for the world. His expression didn't change. He just sat there, staring at his hands. At ordinary human hands, which were actually dozens of different hands. The system said the experiment was complete. The model had been found. The data had been collected. The people could be returned to Earth. The passage would be opened. Ethan asked if it was everyone, or just those who wanted to go. The system was silent for a long time, 12 seconds that dragged on like hours. Then it replied, "Those who want to." Ethan nodded. Then he asked the next question. What would happen to June? The system replied without a pause. The proto-class is part of Arcadia's architecture, its supporting structure. Without it, the world will begin to collapse in 72 hours. If the system concludes the experiment and closes the sandbox, June will cease to exist. If Arcadia remains, June will remain, but as a proto-class, as a template, without the right to a permanent form. Ethan stood up from the rock. He looked at the letters in the air, then at June. June sat there, waiting. Just like on the first day. Thin, quiet, with a small candle burning in his eyes. Ethan told the system that the experiment was not complete, that he had a condition. June stays, not as a proto-class, as a human, as a resident of Arcadia, with a name, with the right to choose who to be, with the right to remain in one body forever if he wishes. The system processed the request. The letters flickered. Then came the response. To preserve the proto-class as an autonomous unit without compromising Arcadia's architectural integrity, a second anchor point is required. A second proto-class that will assume the supporting function. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered. The 9 missing workers whom the system had scattered across the continent on the first day. He had found 7 of them over the course of 2.5 years. Amber was one of them. Hannah was another. Bran, Mira, Alice, Faye, Leo. 7 out of 9. 2 remained. Penny had found one of them in her archives 3 months ago. A line in the database. An anomalous entry. An unnamed worker. No class, no settlement, no lord. Lost in the system data like a typo in a kilometer-long table. A little boy. Ethan sent Nauri to find him 2 weeks ago. Nauri found him in a ruined settlement on the edge of the wildlands. Alone, in a dugout, surviving on roots and rainwater. 10 years old, skinny, quiet, eyes like June's on the first day. Empty, waiting. Nauri carried him on her back. For the last 20 kilometers he slept pressed against her. Nauri, who ate with her hands and scorned politeness, carried him carefully, as if he were a glass vase. She didn't say a word about it, but Amber saw it and silently sewed the boy a pair of small boots out of deerskin that very night. Ethan crouched down in front of the boy. He looked into his eyes. The same eyes June had had 3 years ago. An empty room, an unlit candle. Ethan asked, "What's your name?" The boy blinked, long, slowly. The sign above his head flickered. The letters appeared, one by one, like dawn. Rin. The system accepted it. The text in the air updated. Second proto-class activated. Anchor point established. Architectural integrity preserved. June's proto-class transferred to autonomous unit status. Classification, free resident. The letters melted into the air. The system fell silent. The wind blew across the empty field. Ethan stood there, breathing. June stood beside him. His ID tag flickered and updated. Proto-class disappeared. In its place appeared simply, June. Level 25. Class. Not assigned. Race. Not assigned. Status. Free. For the first time in 3 years, June had no class, no race, no role. He was simply June, and he could choose. They returned to Garen Sylvain 3 days later. Rin walked between them, holding June's hand, not because he was afraid, but because June had reached out first. Ethan announced to the residents that anyone who wanted to return to Earth could do so. The system would open the passage in a week. 7 days to decide. For 7 days, the city lived a strange double life. People worked as usual, ate as usual, went to Leanne's concert as usual, but there was something in everyone's eyes. A question, a choice. Earth or Arcadia? The past or the present? Some left. 32 people out of 300. Those who still had families on Earth. Those who couldn't forget. Those who wanted asphalt, electricity, and the internet. Ethan stood by the passageway and said goodbye to each one, by name, holding their hand. To each, he said the same phrase. Thank you for being here. Barrett stayed behind. He stood next to Ethan and watched as people walked into the white light of the passageway. Ethan asked him why. Barrett replied that no one was waiting for him in Georgia. But here, Hannah makes mac and cheese every Thursday. And here, for the first time in 45 years, he feels that his work matters to someone other than shareholders.
Soyeon stayed. Ethan didn't even ask. She looked at him like he was an idiot when he approached her with the question. She said that on Earth, her blueprints get stolen, but here, her name is on every building. And that she hadn't yet finished the northern quarter, the western wall, the new school, and the library. She didn't have time to leave. Amber stayed. She didn't explain why. Ethan didn't ask. She stood in the workshop sewing a new raincoat, not for June, for Rin, a small one, made of soft leather, with double seams that stretch, to grow into. Leanne stayed. She said one sentence. Here, people listen to me. On Earth, they told me that music isn't a profession. Here, my music saves lives. Nowry couldn't leave. She was home. Arcadia is her world. But for the first time in 3 years, she said she felt at home not only in the forests of Sylvain, but here as well. In a city of stone and wood, among people who smell of iron and bread. Hannah stayed. She said that here she has someone to cook for, that on Earth she cooked for work, for strangers, for clients. Here she cooks for her own, for her family. She said that word and fell silent. Then she took out a cigarette and went out to smoke. Penny stayed. She said that here her numbers matter, that on Earth people told her a girl shouldn't be a nerd. Here, the whole city runs on her numbers, and she won't let anyone else keep track of the grain because last time Leo made a mistake by 14 units, and she wouldn't be able to live with that. Ethan stayed. To his surprise, he realized this not on the 7th day, but on the 1st. He didn't want to go back. The rental studio in Ulsan, assembly line number 7, corporate parties, the stubble after a taxi ride. All that was in his past life. This was the real one. Here were his people, his city, his world, which he had built from a single worker and a single question. The passage closed on the 7th day. The white light went out. The panel flashed. The return protocol was complete. 32 residents returned. 268 residents remained. Arcadia was switched to permanent mode. Ethan didn't pay attention to the last line. He looked at his people, at his city, at the evening that was falling, just like every other evening. That evening, Ethan sat on the wall. June sat beside him. Down below in the courtyard, the city came to life. Leanne played on the stone stage, and golden threads floated through the air among the listeners. Hannah was pouring soup from the kitchen window and shouting that it would get cold. Soyeon was arguing with Thomas about the angle of the new tower and waving a blueprint around. Thomas shook his head and pointed at the foundation. Amber sat on the porch of the workshop, sewing boots for Rin. Rin sat next to her, watching the needle pierce the leather. His eyes were no longer empty. A small candle burned within them, just like June's had 3 years ago. Nowry sat at the other end of the wall, silent, calm. She turned her head toward Ethan. He wasn't looking at her. She handed him the flask. He took it, took a sip, passed it to June. Bran stood by the forge, teaching the young dwarf how to forge hinges. Mark sat by the gate with the wolves, carving a little dragon out of wood. For Rin. David stood by the fountain in the center of the square, the fountain he'd built himself. Water rose from the stone and fell back down. He was no longer afraid of fire, but he loved water even more. Alice was watering the garden in the last light of evening. Faye was putting her daughter to bed in a house with curtains she had sewn herself. Mira was checking her students' notebooks by candlelight. Leo was counting the stars in the sky and muttering numbers. Cole was drawing a new map, a map of the city that had sprung up from an empty field. Penny ran across the yard with a birch bark scroll, shouting that she'd found an error in the grain tally, that it was a disaster, and that Leo had to recount the third warehouse immediately. The system panel flickered quietly before Ethan's eyes. It hadn't called him Lord in a long time. It called him Ethan. Just Ethan. June looked at him, then at the sky, at the 2 moons rising above the horizon. One big, one small.
He watched the clouds drifting between the moons. He'd seen them from above, once, when he was a dragon. He remembered what it was like. The wind, the height, the fire in his chest. Freedom. He could ask Ethan to turn him back into a dragon. He could ask to be an elf, or a dwarf, or anyone he wanted. For the first time in his life, he could choose and stick with that choice forever. June looked at his hands. Ordinary. Human. Calloused from the axe and the plane, with a cut on his left index finger from a chisel that had slipped yesterday. He looked at Ethan. Then he said quietly, "Sir, my name is June. I want to be a carpenter. Just a carpenter." "You may." Ethan was looking at the sunset, at his city, at the people living below, at the world he had built. Not with a sword, not with magic, not with force, with names. He replied, "Sure, I'll build you a workshop." Behind them, standing against the wall, were 6 women. Soyeon with a blueprint, Amber with a needle, Leanne with a violin, Naori with a bow slung across her back, Hana with a wooden spoon, Penny with a scroll. Not because he ordered them to, because they wanted to. The panel flashed one last time, a single line. Control model accepted. Architecture updated. Arcadia transitioned to permanent mode. Operator status complete. Ethan status resident. Evaluations canceled. Ethan read it. Evaluations canceled. No one else will die at the end of the month. No one else will be destroyed for being weaker than others. He read that and closed the panel. Not because it was no longer needed, because right now, he didn't need numbers. He needed the sunset. And silence. And the person beside him who finally knew who he was. June the carpenter. Just June. With the name Ethan gave him 3 years ago in an empty field under 2 moons. Down below, Ren was sitting on the porch of Amber's workshop, trying on his new boots. They were a little too big for him to grow into. He looked up, at June on the wall, and smiled. 2 proto-classes, 2 beginnings. One had found his name, the other was just getting started. Ethan Park's story began with a question. "What's your name?" It ended with an answer. "My name is June. I want to be a carpenter." And between the question and the answer lay a whole world.